Good evening. I want to share something that happened to me a few years back. Something I have kept entirely to myself until now, mostly because I know how it sounds. I am not a storyteller. I am not a dramatic person. My ex-wife used to joke that I was the most boring man she had ever loved, and she was probably right. I am a bus driver. I have been driving the same regional routes in the rural South for going on 23 years. I know every pothole, every crooked mile marker, every diner that closes too early, and every gas station that stays open too late. I am telling this from behind the curtain of anonymity because some of my co-workers follow these kinds of channels, and I have no interest in being the guy who claims he picked up a ghost. I have a retirement to think about, but I also believe that what happened to me deserves to be heard, if only because of what it meant to someone else, someone very real, very alive, who needed to hear something she had been waiting 15 years to receive. So here it is. It was the second week of October, a Tuesday, and I was running the Route 7 Evening Express, a meandering line that starts in Hattiesburg, cuts through 4 small towns, and ends in a place called Waynesboro, Mississippi, just before midnight. It is not a glamorous route. Half the seats are empty most nights, and on weekdays in the off-season, I am lucky to carry 8 or 10 passengers total. The road passes through long stretches of pine forest, and in autumn, when the fog comes in off the creek bottoms, the headlights of the bus barely cut 20 feet ahead of you. You learn to drive by instinct out there. You learn to trust the painted lines even when you cannot see them. I had picked up my last scheduled passengers in a town called Prentice, which is about 40 miles from the Waynesboro terminal. There were 4 of them, 2 young men who fell asleep immediately, a teenager with headphones who never looked up from her phone, and a heavy-set man in a postal service jacket who smelled strongly of cigarette smoke. After Prentice, the road narrows and the towns disappear. There are no more scheduled stops until Waynesboro, and in all my years on that route, I had never once picked anyone up between those 2 points, not because the regulations forbid it, but because there is simply nothing out there. No houses visible from the road, no gas stations, nothing but trees and the occasional dirt road cutting off into darkness. This is why what happened next surprised me the way it did. About 18 miles past Prentice, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the road. I almost did not register it at first. My mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about whether I had remembered to leave the porch light on at home, and the fog was thick that night. But then the figure raised a hand very slowly, and I saw that it was a woman, an older woman from what I could tell, in a pale coat. She was standing in a spot where there was a very slight widening of the shoulder, as if that particular stretch of road had once had a bus stop that had long since been removed. I slowed the bus. I know the regulations. I know that stopping outside of scheduled points is a gray area and that my company frowns on it. But it was past 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and there was a woman standing alone on the side of a dark highway in the middle of the woods, and the temperature had dropped into the low 50s. I did not consider my options for very long. I opened the door. She climbed the steps carefully, one at a time, holding the rail with both hands. She was older than I had initially thought, perhaps late 70s, with white hair cut short and a pair of glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She wore the pale coat, which I now saw was a cream-colored wool, and she carried a small purse and nothing else, no luggage, no bag. She smiled at me when she reached the top of the steps. "Thank you, honey," she said. "I wasn't sure anyone would stop." "You all right, ma'am?" I asked. "Oh, I'm just fine," she said pleasantly. "I'm trying to get to Waynesboro. My daughter lives there. I promised her I'd come by tonight." I told her the fare, and she dug around in her purse for a moment and produced the exact change, which she counted out into my palm, very carefully, quarters and dimes, the way older people sometimes pay. I closed the door and pulled back onto the road. In the mirror, I watched her make her way to a seat about 4 rows back, on the right side, by the window. She settled in, smoothed her coat across her lap, and looked out at the darkness passing by. For the first few miles, she said nothing, and I said nothing. That is normal. That is how most passengers are. But somewhere around the 12-mile mark, she spoke up, loud enough for me to hear over the engine. "You've been driving this road a long time," she said. It was not a question. 23 years, I said. "You must know it by heart." "Just about." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you like it, driving at night?" I thought about it honestly. "Some nights," I said. "When the road is clear and it's quiet, there's something peaceful about it, just you and the road." "I imagine so," she said. She asked me if I had family, and I told her about my two daughters, one in Biloxi, one in Atlanta, and about my grandchild who had just started walking. She listened carefully, the way people who are genuinely interested in others listen, nodding even though she was behind me, and I could only see her in the mirror. When I finished, she smiled. "A grandfather," she said. "That's a good thing to be." "Yes, ma'am," I agreed. She told me a little about herself without my asking. She said her name was Margaret Maggie, she said. Most people called her Maggie, and that she had lived most of her life in a small town outside of Brookhaven. She mentioned a husband who had passed some years ago, a garden she was proud of, and her daughter in Waynesboro. She spoke about the daughter the way people speak about someone they love very much, but have not seen in a while, with a kind of tender, aching quality, like pressing gently on a bruise. "It's been too long since I've seen her," she said. "I keep meaning to go, and then one thing or another gets in the way. You know how it is. You think you have all the time in the world, and then you turn around and years have gone by." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I know exactly how that is." "Tell your daughters you love them," she said. "Don't wait for a reason, just tell them." "I will," I said. About 5 miles outside of Waynesboro, she spoke again. She said her daughter's name was Claire, and that she lived on Elm Street, near the old water tower. She mentioned it almost as if she were reminding herself, murmuring the address like a small prayer, the way you recite directions when you're worried about forgetting them. And then she said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. "I just need her to know I'm all right," she said. "That's all. I just need her to know." I thought it was an odd thing to say. I assumed she meant that she wanted her daughter not to worry about her, that she was getting on in years, and her daughter fretted. I told her that daughters have a way of worrying about their mothers no matter what, and she laughed quietly at that. "That's true," she said. "Claire always worried, even when she was little." That was more or less the last exchange we had of any length. I made the turn onto the main road into Waynesboro a few minutes later and began the approach to the terminal. I checked the mirror to let her know we were close. She was not there. I looked again. The seat was empty. The two young men who had boarded in Prentice were still asleep. The girl with the headphones had her head tilted back against the window. The postal worker was staring at his phone. The row where Maggie had been sitting was completely empty. I pulled into the terminal, set the brake, and stood up. I told myself she had simply moved to a different seat, or perhaps she had gone to the small restroom at the back of the bus. I walked the entire length of the aisle. I checked the restroom. I looked under the seats, which I realized sounds strange, but by that point I was not thinking very clearly. There was no one. There was not even the impression of warmth on the seat cushion where she had been sitting, though the night was cold enough that it should have held some residual heat from her body. I went back to my seat and sat for a long moment while my 4 passengers collected themselves and filed off the bus. The postal worker gave me a nod on his way out. The girl with the headphones walked by without looking up. The terminal was mostly empty at that hour, lit with the flat fluorescent glow that makes everything look slightly unreal. I thought about what the most sensible explanation was. I considered that I had perhaps imagined her, that the fog and the monotony of the drive had conspired to produce some kind of waking dream. But I had a conversation with her. I remembered the weight of the coins she had placed in my palm. I remembered the smell of her, something faintly floral, like powder or dried lavender. You do not imagine a smell like that. I sat in that terminal for 40 minutes. I know because I checked the clock when I arrived, and again when I finally decided to start looking. I pulled out my phone and searched for Margaret Maggie, Waynesboro, Mississippi, obituary. I do not know exactly why I searched that. I think some part of me already knew, in the way you sometimes know things before you are ready to admit them. I found what I was looking for in the third result, a brief notice from the Waynesboro Gazette, dated 15 years prior. A woman named Margaret Louise Tanner, 71 years old, had died in a vehicle accident on State Highway 42, the same highway I drove every night during a rainstorm in October. She had been traveling alone. The accident occurred approximately 18 miles east of Prentice. The article included a photograph. It was a small photograph, the kind that runs alongside obituaries in small-town papers, slightly overexposed. The subject smiling in that formal way people smile when they know their picture is being taken. She was wearing a light-colored blouse. Her hair was white and cut short. She wore glasses on a chain around her neck. I set my phone face down on the seat beside me and looked at the road outside for a very long time. What I felt was not exactly fear. I had been afraid briefly in the moments when I realized she was gone, a cold, disoriented kind of fear. The sensation of the floor dropping out from under a certainty you did not even know you were standing on. But that had passed. What I felt now was something more complicated, something closer to sorrow and to the peculiar weight of a responsibility that no one had asked me to carry. She had said her daughter's name was Claire. She had given me the street. I spent that night in Waynesboro rather than making the drive back, which I sometimes do when I finish late. I slept badly. In the morning, I drove to the address she had mentioned, Elm Street, near the water tower. It was a small house with a tidy yard and a pickup truck in the driveway. I sat outside for 15 minutes, genuinely unsure of what I was going to say. I knocked on the door. The woman who answered was in her mid-50s, dark-haired with threads of grey at the temples. She had the look of someone who had been through something difficult and come out the other side still standing but not unscathed. She looked at me with polite wariness, the way people look at strangers who show up unannounced. I told her my name. I told her I drove Route 7. I told her I knew it was going to sound strange, and I asked if her mother's name had been Margaret. The wariness in her face shifted immediately into something raw and unguarded, and she gripped the doorframe. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, that was my mother's name." I told her everything. I stood there on her porch and went through it all, from the figure on the side of the road to the conversation, to the empty seat, to the obituary. I told her about the coins counted out carefully into my palm. I told her about the lavender smell. She listened without interrupting, and her eyes went bright and wet, though she did not cry, not right then. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me, "Did she say anything at the end? Did she say anything else before she was gone?" I thought about it. I told her what Margaret had said as precisely as I could remember it. I just need her to know I'm all right, that's all. I just need her to know. Something in Claire's face came undone, quietly and completely, like a knot finally releasing. She pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment. When she lowered it, she said, "She died on her way here. She was coming to see me for my birthday. We had argued a few months before something stupid. I can't even remember what anymore, and she was coming to make things right. I never got to talk to her. I've spent 15 years not knowing if she was at peace, if she was angry with me. I did not have anything useful to say to that, so I did not say anything." We stood there on the porch for a moment in the cool morning air, two strangers joined by something neither of us fully understood. She thanked me. I told her there was nothing to thank me for. She disagreed. I have thought about that night many times since. I have turned it over the way you turn a strange stone in your hand, examining it from different angles, trying to find the edge where it stops making sense, and I cannot find that edge. I cannot make it fit into any framework that my 23 years of ordinary, sensible life have given me. What I keep returning to is this: she did not seem lost. She was not wandering or frightened the way that, at least in the stories, spirits are supposed to be. She seemed, if anything, purposeful. She knew where she was going. She had been trying to get there for 15 years, and on one October night, by some convergence of fog and loneliness and an old bus driver who stops when he should not, she finally did. I still drive Route 7. I drive it every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and I know that stretch of highway east of Prentice as well as I know anything in this world. I have not seen her again. I do not expect to, but I think about what she told me, and I have called my daughters every Sunday since. I do not always have something important to say. Sometimes I just tell them I'm thinking about them, that I love them. They tease me for it. They say I've gotten sentimental in my old age, and maybe they're right. But I think about a woman in a cream-colored coat, counting out dimes in the dark, just trying to reach her daughter before it was too late. And I decide that a little sentimentality is something I can live with. We continue. I want to start by saying that I don't usually share things like this. I'm a pretty private person by nature, and the kind of guy who, even when something terrible happens, tends to process it alone rather than talk about it. But this has been sitting with me for almost 8 months now, and I've reached a point where I genuinely feel like I need to get it out. So here it is. It started the night I got a voicemail from my sister Claire. I should tell you a little about Claire first, because understanding her situation matters if you want to understand why I reacted the way I did. Claire is 4 years younger than me, and for most of our adult lives we've been close, not in the constant texting kind of way, but in the way that counts, where you know that if something ever went truly wrong, the other person would drop everything. She went through a rough divorce about 3 years ago. Her ex-husband wasn't a violent man, but he was cold and controlling in the quiet, exhausting way that's harder to explain to other people. When it finally ended, she decided she needed distance, and not just from him, but from the city, from everything familiar. She found a job managing inventory for a small lumber company and moved to a town called Mill Haven, which is about 140 miles north of where I live. Small place, maybe 4,000 people, surrounded by state forest on 3 sides. She said she loved it, said the quiet helped her breathe again. I believed her mostly, though I worried sometimes about how isolated she was. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, her neighbors were sparse, and she had always been the kind of person who kept her fear to herself until it had nowhere left to go. Which is why when I woke up to a voicemail from her at 2:14 in the morning, I knew immediately that something was wrong. Not just inconveniently wrong, the kind of wrong that pulls you out of bed and turns your hands cold. Her voice on the message was controlled, but only barely. She said there was someone outside her house. She said she had been hearing sounds near the back fence for the past hour, and that 20 minutes ago she had seen a flashlight beam moving through her yard from the bedroom window. She said she had called the police and they told her a patrol car would come by, but that was 45 minutes ago and no one had arrived yet. She said, and I remember this part exactly because it scared me more than anything else in the message. I just need someone to know where I am. I called her back immediately. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again, same thing. I texted her and watched the screen for a reply that didn't come. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I didn't. I sat on the edge of my bed for about 30 seconds feeling completely useless, and then I started trying to figure out how to get to her as fast as possible. My car was not an option. This is one of those details that looking back feels almost cruelly timed. I had dropped it off at the mechanic 2 days earlier for what turned out to be a failing alternator, and they had told me it wouldn't be ready until Thursday. It was now the early hours of Wednesday morning. I had been getting by on walking and public transit, which obviously meant nothing at 2 in the morning when I needed to cover 140 miles of highway. I opened a rideshare app and put in Claire's address. There was one driver available. His name was listed as Marcus, his rating was 4.6, and he was 4 minutes away. I confirmed the ride without thinking twice. He pulled up in a dark green sedan that had clearly seen better years. There was a long, shallow dent running along the rear passenger door, and one of the side mirrors had been replaced with a version that didn't quite match the car's color. None of that mattered to me. I got in. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't offensive exactly, not rotten, not dirty. It was more like industrial solvent, or maybe the inside of a hardware store. Sharp and chemical with something underneath it that I couldn't quite name. It reminded me of the smell in my grandfather's workshop when I was a child. That particular combination of machine oil and sawdust and something older. I told myself it was just an old car and let it go. Marcus was in his late 40s, I'd guess, maybe early 50s. He was heavy-set with thick forearms and grey at his temples, and he wore a plain dark jacket despite it being a warm night. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror when I got in, but didn't say anything. I told him the situation, that I had a family emergency, that I needed to get to Millhaven as fast as was reasonably safe, that I was happy to tip well if he could make good time. He nodded once and said, "I know the way." That was it. He pulled out and we drove in silence. I spent the first 30 minutes of that drive with my phone in my hand, trying Claire's number every few minutes and staring at her texts. Nothing came back. I told myself she had probably just fallen asleep with her phone on silent, which was something she sometimes did. I told myself the police had probably been there, everything was fine, and she hadn't thought to call me back because she knew I was on the way. I ran through every reasonable explanation I could think of, and for stretches of a few minutes at a time, I almost convinced myself. Around the 40-minute mark, Marcus took an exit I didn't recognize. Route 9 North, according to the sign, though the app on my phone was still showing the main highway route. "Is this a different way?" I asked. "Cuts off about 22 minutes, he said. "Road's empty at this hour. We'll make better time." I looked at my phone. The GPS was struggling a little with the new route, but seemed to be rerouting. I decided to trust him. He'd said 4.6. He knew the way. I watched the dark tree line close in on both sides as we left the interchange behind. Route 9 was not what I'd call a road with a lot of character. It was narrow and unmarked past a certain point, with cracked asphalt and no center line, flanked on both sides by dense forest that pressed right up to the shoulder. Marcus drove at a steady, unhurried pace, and I noticed he had stopped checking his phone entirely, which actually made me trust him slightly more. A lot of drivers I'd had were constantly glancing at the map. Marcus looked like he'd driven this road before. We were somewhere around the 50-minute mark when I lost cell service. The signal bar went to 0 and stayed there. I told myself it was temporary, just a dead zone between towers, and that it would come back. It didn't. I was about to lean forward and ask Marcus how far we still had to go when the car lurched. It wasn't a dramatic lurch, it was the particular kind of controlled deceleration you do when you suddenly see something in the road and don't want to brake too hard. Marcus said nothing. He slowed the car to a near stop and leaned forward over the wheel, peering through the windshield. "What was that?" I asked. "Something crossed," he said. "Big. Might have clipped the bumper." He put the car in park, right there on the shoulder, not even fully off the road, just angled slightly toward the tree line and opened his door. "I'll check the front," he said, and he got out. I sat there for a moment watching him through the windshield as he walked around to the front of the car. He crouched down, looked at something, stood up, and then he walked to the edge of the road where the asphalt gave way to gravel and then to grass and then to the dark margin of the forest, and he just kept walking. I watched him step past the tree line and disappear. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think it's important. I wasn't immediately afraid, I was confused, and then I was irritated. I had told this man I had a family emergency. I had told him I needed to get somewhere, and now he was wandering off into the woods on a road with no cell service at 3 in the morning as if that were a completely normal thing to do. I remember thinking, what is wrong with people? I waited 5 minutes, maybe 6 or 7. I tried my phone again, still no signal. I tried the door handle to get out and then stopped myself. There was something about stepping out of that car onto that dark road that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, and for a moment I just sat there, one hand on the handle, listening. That was when I heard it. Not a dramatic sound, not a howl or a scream, just a low, rhythmic sound from somewhere off to the left in the tree line, almost like breathing, but too slow, too measured, like something very large and very patient, just waiting. I want to be clear, I am not a dramatic person. I do not spook easily. I have gone camping alone. I have driven through bad neighborhoods at night. I have had experiences that should have frightened me more than they did. But whatever made that sound sent something cold and animal through my chest that I have no rational explanation for, and I found myself thinking with absolute clarity that I needed to find Marcus and get back in this car as fast as possible. I got out. The night was warm, but I felt cold anyway. There was no moon visible, just cloud cover that turned the sky a flat, lightless gray. The forest on both sides of the road was just a black wall. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it toward the tree line where Marcus had disappeared. There was a gap in the underbrush, not quite a path, but the suggestion of one, as if something had moved through that space repeatedly over time. Branches pushed back, undergrowth trampled flat. I called Marcus's name once, quietly, no answer, and I went in. The trees were old growth, the kind with trunks too wide to wrap your arms around, and they shut out what little ambient light the cloud-covered sky had offered. My flashlight made a circle of about 10 feet ahead of me, and that was all I had. The ground underfoot was soft and uneven, and twice I stumbled on roots I hadn't seen. I want to describe what it smelled like in there because it matters. The same chemical smell from the car, but stronger. And underneath it, something organic, something damp and animal that I couldn't place. And something else underneath that, something older, that smelled like nothing I have a name for and that I hope I never smell again. The path, and at this point it had become genuinely path-like, opened up after about 3 minutes of walking into a clearing, and in the clearing was a structure. It had clearly once been a building of some kind, stone foundation mostly collapsed, with partial walls still standing in 2 or 3 places. There was an intact roof section on one corner, low and heavy, supported by what looked like newer timber that someone had added more recently. The original structure could have been 100 years old. The additions looked recent, within the last decade, maybe less. There were things on the ground around the structure. I didn't look at them closely, I didn't want to. I will say there were bones, some of them large, and that they had clearly been there long enough to be past fresh, but not long enough to have scattered. and there was a smell coming from the covered section of the structure, that same deep, organic smell, much stronger here, and a low sound that I felt more in my sternum than heard with my ears. I stood at the edge of the clearing and I did not move. I am not sure how long I stood there. It might have been 10 seconds. It felt like 3 minutes. And then a hand came down hard on my shoulder from behind, and I bit back a shout that would have been embarrassing to describe, and Marcus's voice, very low and very close to my ear, said, "We need to go, right now. Don't run yet, walk, don't make noise, walk." I walked. He was right behind me, one hand still on my shoulder, steering me back toward the gap in the trees. I could hear something moving in the structure behind us, something that sounded too heavy for the space it was in, and then something that sounded like it was no longer in the structure. "Now run," Marcus said. "I have not run like that since I was a kid. I ran with no regard for the roots or the dark or anything else, just the narrow beam of my flashlight bouncing ahead of me and the sound of Marcus's feet behind me, and further back, something else. A sound I will not try to describe precisely because I don't think I can do it accurately, and I think the imprecision would make it sound less frightening than it was. Something was coming through those trees in a way that did not sound like anything I recognized. We broke out of the tree line and hit the road, and Marcus ran past me to the driver's side door and wrenched it open, and I got into the back seat and pulled the door shut so hard the whole car shook. Marcus's keys weren't in the ignition. He was patting his pockets with both hands, and I could see his jaw was tight and his eyes were very bright. I looked out the back window and saw nothing, just dark. The keys finally appeared from his jacket's inner pocket, and he got them in the ignition on the second try, and the engine turned over and he pulled onto the road and accelerated hard. We drove for several minutes in complete silence before either of us spoke. "Are you okay?" I asked, which was not the question I actually wanted to ask, but seemed like the right place to start. He nodded. His hands on the wheel were steady, which surprised me because mine were not. "What was that?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he didn't look at me in the mirror. He kept his eyes on the road. "My brother disappeared out here," he said. 9 years ago this October. He was doing a solo hiking trip through the state forest. He was experienced, he'd done it a dozen times. He never came home. They searched for 11 days and found nothing. Not equipment, not clothing, not anything. Just gone." I waited. He continued. "I drive Route 9 sometimes, not always, maybe a few times a year. There's a point back there where I always slow down. I don't really know why anymore. It became a habit. Tonight I thought I saw a light in the trees just for a second. I thought..." He stopped. "I thought it might be something, some evidence, something I'd missed. I've been over every public record about his disappearance. I've talked to the ranger station, to the county sheriff's department, to 2 private investigators over the years. Nobody found anything. And tonight I saw a light and I thought I had to stop." He was quiet for another few seconds. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know what you're going to say, and you're right. You told me you had a family emergency. I had no business stopping. I have no excuse for it." I wanted to be angry, I almost was, but there was something in his voice, not distress exactly, but exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something for a very long time that made it difficult. "What do you think that was?" I asked. "Back there." "I don't know," he said, and then after a pause, "I don't want to know." He didn't speak again for the rest of the drive, though I tried a few more times. He had said what he was going to say, and that was the end of it. The cell signal came back about 15 minutes later, and I called Claire immediately. She picked up on the second ring, and the relief that hit me when I heard her voice was almost physical. She was fine. She told me the police had arrived about an hour after she'd called. Apparently there had been some kind of accident tying up the one patrol car assigned to that part of the county. They had found signs that someone had been near the property, a footprint in the garden, a section of the back fence pushed in, but no one had actually tried to get inside. The officer had walked the perimeter and told her it was most likely someone cutting through, maybe a drunk or a teenager, and that he'd seen similar things in the area before. He had agreed to drive past her street a couple of times before dawn. By the time Marcus pulled up in front of Claire's house, she was standing on the porch waiting for me. I got out and she hugged me, and I held on to her for a moment longer than I probably needed to, thinking about the sound I had heard in those trees and feeling very glad to be standing in the light of her porch lamp. Marcus barely glanced at me when I passed him the cash. He was already looking at his phone. I thought about saying something else, but I didn't know what there was left to say. He drove away while Claire and I were still standing on the porch. and I watched his taillights until they turned the corner and disappeared. I want to tell you that I know how that place explains itself. I know that old structures in the middle of the woods collect all kinds of things: animals, transient people, the gradual accumulation of debris that looks more sinister at 3 in the morning than it does in daylight. I know that sound I heard could have been a deer, a bear, something large but ordinary that I startled in the dark. I know that the shadows at the edge of a flashlight beam create shapes that aren't there, and that fear compounds what you see until ordinary things look like something else entirely. I know all of that. I choose to believe most of it, but I also know what I smelled, and I know what it sounded like when that thing stopped being inside the structure and started being outside it. And I know that Marcus, who had been driving that road for 9 years looking for traces of his brother, took one look at whatever had been following us and told me to run. I tried to contact him about 3 weeks later. I opened the app and looked up my ride history and tried to reach him through the in-app messaging. No response. A week after that I tried again. The account appeared to be deactivated. I found the rideshare's driver support contact and asked them if there was any way to get a message to a driver I'd ridden with. They told me drivers can deactivate their accounts at any time and that they couldn't share contact information. I thanked them and hung up. 4 months after that night, I was reading the local news from that region. I'd started checking it occasionally, which tells you something about how much that night had stayed with me, and I came across a brief item from the county sheriff's department. A man had been found walking along Route 9 in the early morning hours, approximately 2 miles from the Route 9 junction. He was described as disoriented and unresponsive to basic questions. He had no ID on him and no phone. He was taken to the regional hospital for evaluation. The article was 3 sentences long, and there was no follow-up that I could find. I can't tell you for certain that man was Marcus. I have no way of knowing. But I have thought about it often since then, and I don't think I'll be driving Route 9 anytime soon to look for answers. Some nights you get out clean, some roads you take once, and once is enough. This is my story. I know it went long. I wanted to put everything down the way it actually happened without cutting corners. Thank you for taking the time to listen to it. We continue. There's a question I've been sitting with for a long time now, and I want to ask it to all of you before I get into anything else. Have you ever experienced something so genuinely unexplainable that you decided right then and there that you would simply never speak of it again? Not because you were afraid people would judge you or laugh at you, but because the act of saying it out loud somehow made it more real, made it something you actually had to live with rather than something you could tuck away in the back of your mind and pretend was a dream. That was me for almost 3 years. Good evening, everyone. For those of you who are regular listeners, welcome back. And for those of you hearing this podcast for the first time, I'm genuinely glad you found your way here. My name is Kevin Hargrove. I'm 41 years old. I was born and raised in Hazard, Kentucky. Yes, that's a real place. No, it's not as dramatic as it sounds. Although after what I'm about to tell you, maybe it is. And for the past 15 years, I've worked as a pharmaceutical delivery driver for a regional medical distributor. Now, before any of you picture me driving one of those little white vans around a neighborhood delivering vitamins, let me clarify. I drive a medium-duty cargo truck, not a full semi, but not small either. And I cover rural routes through eastern Kentucky and parts of southern West Virginia, delivering medications, IV supplies, and emergency medical equipment to small clinics and rural hospitals that can't always get what they need from the big distribution centers. My routes are long, they're winding, they go through some of the most remote stretches of road in the eastern United States, and for the most part, I do them at night, because that's when the roads are clear and the deliveries can be waiting for morning staff when they clock in. I tell you all of this because the context matters a lot. I am not by nature a superstitious man. I grew up in a deeply religious household. My mother was the kind of woman who had Bible verses on every wall and prayed before every meal without exception. But somewhere in my late 20s, I just sort of drifted away from all of that. Not bitterly, not dramatically. I just became the kind of person who believed in what he could see, touch, and verify. My wife, Sandra, calls me aggressively practical, which I always took as a compliment, even though she definitely didn't mean it that way. So when I tell you that what happened to me on the night of October 14, 3 years ago, changed the way I see the world, I want you to understand the weight of that statement coming from someone like me. It was a Tuesday, I remember that clearly, because Tuesdays were my longest routes. I'd leave the distribution center in Whitesburg around 9:30 in the evening and wouldn't get home until sometimes 4 or 5 in the morning. And that particular night, my route took me through a stretch of county road 715, that cuts through the mountains toward a small clinic in a town I'll call Millhaven, though that's not its real name. I don't want to get too specific about the location for reasons that'll become obvious. The weather had been ugly all day, not storming exactly, but that persistent, heavy Appalachian rain that feels personal, like it's specifically targeting you and your windshield. The roads up in that part of the mountains get genuinely treacherous when they're wet because they weren't exactly engineered with modern safety standards in mind. And at night, with no streetlights for miles at a stretch, you're relying entirely on your headlights and your instincts. I was about 40 minutes outside of Millhaven, running slightly ahead of schedule for once, listening to a sports radio program that kept cutting out every time I went through one of the valleys. So when I saw him, he was standing on the gravel shoulder of the road on the right-hand side, facing the direction I was driving. He had a single piece of luggage, one of those old-fashioned hard-shell suitcases, the kind that has two metal latches on the front and a handle that you'd carry rather than roll. He was wearing a full suit, dark jacket, light-colored shirt, no tie, and he was just standing there perfectly still in the rain, looking forward. Now, I want to be honest with all of you because I think that's what makes these stories worth listening to. My very first reaction was not concern. My first reaction was irritation. Because I have a policy, a firm, inflexible 15-year-old policy about not picking up people on the road. It's not that I think I'm better than anyone, it's that I'm driving a vehicle filled with controlled substances and my contract is extremely clear about unauthorized passengers. One incident and I lose everything. My job, my certification, my livelihood. So I saw this man and I thought, that's not my problem. There are people for that. Call 911, let them handle it. And then I got close enough to see him clearly. He was old, not elderly in the sense that he needed help standing. He was standing just fine, perfectly upright, but old in the way that tells you a person has been around long enough to earn it. I'd guess somewhere between 70 and 80. He had a full head of white hair, neat despite the rain, and an expression on his face that I can only describe as patient. Not desperate, not panicked, patient, like a man who had been waiting for something he was completely certain was going to arrive. Something about that expression made me slow down. I want to be clear. I did not intend to stop. I genuinely intended to drive past and call it into the county non-emergency line. Let them know there was an elderly man stranded on 715. That was my plan. And then, before I had consciously made any decision, I found that I had already pulled over and rolled down my window. He walked up to the passenger side without being invited, which should have been strange, but somehow wasn't. Up close, his face was calm in a way that almost felt deliberate, like he was managing his expression with precision. He had dark eyes, darker than you'd expect on a man with white hair. And when he looked at me, it felt less like being seen and more like being read. "I appreciate you stopping," he said. His voice was low and clear, no wavering that you'd expect from an old man who'd been standing in the cold rain. He had a slight accent I couldn't quite place, not quite southern, not quite anything. "I wonder if you might take me as far as you're going tonight." "I'm heading to Millhaven," I said, which was the first time in 15 years I had voluntarily disclosed my route to a stranger. I still don't entirely understand why I said it. "That would suit me just fine," he said, and I let him in. His name, he told me, was August. No last name offered, and I didn't push. He set his suitcase between his feet, buckled his seatbelt with the careful precision of a man who does everything carefully, and settled into the seat in a way that suggested he was comfortable, but not intrusive. He didn't immediately start talking, which I appreciated. He just looked ahead at the rain-soaked road the same way I did. We drove in silence for maybe 4 or 5 minutes before he said quietly, "Your daughter started at a new school this year, didn't she?" I looked at him. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And it was correct. My daughter Lily had transferred to a different middle school in September after we moved across the county line over the summer. "I don't recall mentioning that," I said. "You didn't," he agreed pleasantly, as though this was not at all a strange thing to acknowledge. I'll be honest, my first instinct was not fear. It was the aggressively practical part of my brain kicking in with explanations. Maybe I had said something. Maybe I'd been talking to myself and hadn't realized it. I do that sometimes on long drives. Maybe he'd overheard something. Maybe he was simply guessing lots of men my age have kids who change schools. I talked myself out of the unease. That is probably the most human thing I've ever done, and also possibly the dumbest. He was good at conversation. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about August. He wasn't weird or intense or off-putting the way you might expect from a stranger who just said something unexplainable. He was warm, actually. He asked about my route, seemed genuinely curious about the logistics of pharmaceutical delivery, made a dry observation about the irony of medicine having to travel so far to reach the people who needed it most. And I found myself thinking, this is a smart man, an interesting man. Whoever he is, whatever he's doing out here, he's not a threat. And then, about 20 minutes into the drive, he said, "The argument you had with Sandra 3 weeks ago, the one about the refinancing, you made the right call, by the way. The rates are going to move in your favor by spring." I did not talk myself out of it that time. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Sandra and I had had exactly one real argument in the past 2 months, and it was about whether to refinance our mortgage. It was a private conversation, a genuinely private conversation that took place in our kitchen at 11 o'clock at night with no one else in the house. There was no version of reality in which this man, this stranger I had picked up on a mountain road, should have known about it. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I told you," he said, untroubled. "August. That's not what I mean, and you know it." He turned to look at me, and in the glow of the dashboard lights his expression was... And I've thought about this 100 times since. Kind. Genuinely kind. Not smug, not threatening. Kind. "Some people can see me," he said, "and some cannot. Most cannot. You can. And that's the reason I've been waiting on that road tonight." My phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but the screen said Sandra, and something made me pick it up. "Hey," I said carefully. "Hey, you okay?" Her voice had that specific quality it gets when she's trying not to sound worried and failing. "I just had this feeling. I know that sounds crazy." "I'm fine," I said. "I picked up a hitchhiker, actually, older gentleman stranded on 715. There was a pause. "What hitchhiker?" she said. "Baby, I'm looking at the Life 360 right now. You're on 715, yeah, but it's just showing you. The passenger indicator isn't..." I looked at the seat next to me. August was still there, looking forward at the road, still perfectly present. Still completely real. I could see the rain drying on the lapels of his jacket. For God's sake. "I have to call you back," I said, and I hung up. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The wipers moved back and forth. The rain kept up its quiet, relentless percussion on the roof of the cab. "I'm not going to hurt you," August said simply, and as though this were a reasonable thing to need to clarify, and he understood completely why I might need to hear it. "I'm not capable of that. I want to be very honest with you about that." "Then what do you want?" I asked. My voice was embarrassingly thin. "There's a bridge ahead of you," he said. "About 2 miles up. You have crossed it dozens of times." I knew the one. It crosses a tributary of the Cumberland River, an old concrete span that the county had been allegedly planning to repair for about 6 years. In daylight it looked fine. In the dark and the rain, you trusted it because you always had. "The eastern railing," August said, "has been compromised. A logging truck clipped it 11 days ago, and the report was filed but not yet addressed. The damage isn't visible from the road surface. But if you take that bridge tonight at your normal speed in these conditions and something unexpected happens, if you have to correct suddenly, the railing will not hold." My mouth was completely dry. "How do you..." "Take Spur Road 9 off to the left, about a mile before the bridge," he said. "It adds 40 minutes, but you'll get where you're going." I stared ahead at the darkness. 40 minutes. I was already ahead of schedule. My mind was running through every possible explanation, simultaneously elaborate hoax, medical emergency causing hallucinations, some kind of breakdown, but none of them were sticking. None of them accounted for Sandra's name, for Lily's school, for the refinancing conversation in our kitchen at 11 at night. I picked up my phone and called the Letcher County Sheriff's non-emergency line. The deputy who answered sounded tired and mildly annoyed until I mentioned the bridge on 715, and then his voice changed. "How did you hear about that?" he said. "Someone told me," I said. "We have a report on that, yes sir. It's in the queue. It hasn't been addressed yet. We're recommending alternate routing to anyone who calls in, but we haven't been able to get signs out there tonight with the..." "Thank you," I said, and I ended the call. I took Spur Road 9. It was exactly as unpleasant as you'd expect, a narrow, unpaved road through the mountain that added exactly 43 minutes to my trip and made me genuinely concerned at two separate moments about whether I was going to get the truck stuck in the mud. But I made it to Mill Haven. I unloaded the delivery. The night shift coordinator at the clinic, a young woman named Patricia, who always had enormous amounts of energy for 2 in the morning, signed for everything without incident. When I got back to the truck, the passenger seat was empty. I hadn't heard a door, I hadn't heard anything. The seatbelt was buckled the way he had left it. There was no wet imprint on the seat from his rain-damp clothing. There was nothing to indicate that anyone had ever sat there at all. I drove home. I didn't tell Sandra what had happened that night, not because I didn't trust her, but because I genuinely didn't know how to begin. I'm the aggressively practical one. I'm the person who rolls his eyes affectionately at her ghost shows and her true crime podcasts and her cousin who claims to have seen something in the woods behind his property in Pike County. I didn't have a framework for what had happened to me, and I wasn't ready to build one. 3 days later, I found a local news item, small piece, buried. A freight hauler had gone through the eastern railing of the bridge on 715 in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, the morning after I had driven that route. The driver survived. The river at that spot is shallow and he was fortunate in his injuries. The article described the railing failure as a result of pre-existing structural damage. I read that article 4 times. I've thought about August a great deal since that night. I've thought about what he was, about whether what I experienced was real in the conventional sense or real in some other sense that I don't have language for yet. I've thought about the fact that he knew things he had no way of knowing, and I've thought about the fact that he used all of that knowledge not to frighten me or control me, but to keep me from driving off a mountain road into a river. Whatever August was, he was not there to harm me. I'm certain of that in a way I can't fully explain, and I've stopped trying to. What I can tell you is this: I still drive that route. I crossed the repaired bridge for the first time about 2 months after that night in daylight, and I felt, I don't know how to describe it, accompanied. Like something was watching over that stretch of road. Not in a threatening way, in the way you feel when you know, without being able to prove it, that you are not entirely alone. I've never seen August again, but I've started paying more attention on dark roads. I slow down when something feels off. I filed 2 separate non-emergency reports about road conditions in the past 3 years, both times about things I noticed and couldn't quite articulate but couldn't ignore either. One of them turned out to be nothing. The other one turned out to be a sinkhole that was just beginning to form under a section of pavement on Route 23, and the county got to it before anyone drove through it. My mother, when I finally told her the story about 8 months after it happened, said without any hesitation, "That was your guardian, Kevin. Some people get to meet theirs." I said, "Mom, I don't believe in that." And she said, "I know, sweetheart. And yet, I don't know what I believe now. I'm not ready to call myself a converted man, and I don't think August would want me to make too much of it. He didn't seem like the type for grand pronouncements. He seemed like the type to sit quietly in a passenger seat in the rain, deliver the information that needed delivering, and disappear without asking for anything in return. But I'll tell you what I've landed on for now, in the absence of anything more certain. I used to think that the most frightening things in this world were the things that couldn't be explained. I don't think that anymore. The most frightening things are the explained ones, the structural reports that sit unaddressed in a queue, the bridges that get clipped by logging trucks and left for spring, the slow accumulation of ordinary failures that become emergencies. August wasn't the frightening thing that night. The bridge was. He was the reason I'm here telling you about it. We continue. My name is Kevin Hart. I'm 29 years old, and I've been working as a paramedic for the past 6 years. I know what you're thinking, that's young to have been doing this job for that long. And you're right. I started training right out of high school because I always knew this was what I wanted to do. Helping people in their worst moments, being the person who shows up when no one else can. That felt like something worth doing with my life, and for the most part I still believe that. But there are nights that test you in ways that have nothing to do with the job description, and what I experienced on Route 9 last October is something I've spent every day since trying to make sense of. I haven't been able to. Maybe telling it out loud will help, probably not, but here it is. That particular shift had been one of the hardest I can remember. 24 hours, which is standard for us, but the calls we ran that day were not standard in any sense of the word. I won't go into details out of respect for the families involved, but I'll tell you this much. We lost someone. a man in his mid-50s, cardiac event. By the time we reached him, the window had already closed. My partner Deshaun handled it the way experienced people learn to handle those things. He went quiet for a while, then he moved on. I've never been able to do that as cleanly as he does. I carry things. By the time my shift ended at 6 in the morning, I felt like someone had filled my chest cavity with wet cement. I live about 45 minutes from the station, and the drive home takes me through a stretch of rural highway that I've always liked, open fields on both sides, almost no traffic at that hour, just long straight road, and the sky getting lighter by degrees. On good days, that drive feels like decompression, a buffer zone between the job and being a normal person. That morning, I needed it badly. I had my window cracked even though it was cold, somewhere around 40 degrees outside. But the cold air was keeping me alert, and the last thing I wanted was to fall asleep at the wheel. The radio was playing something low, I don't even remember what, just noise to fill the silence. I was maybe 20 minutes from home when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was an unknown number, and at 6:15 in the morning, unknown numbers are almost never good news. But something made me pick it up. If you've ever worked in emergency services, you probably understand that instinct, the reflex that makes it impossible to ignore a call even off the clock. "Hello?" I said. The voice on the other end was a woman's. She sounded young, maybe early 30s, and she was trying very hard to sound calm. I could hear it, that specific kind of controlled breathing people do when they're terrified and trying not to completely fall apart. I know that breathing, I've heard it hundreds of times in the back of an ambulance. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said. "I found this number, I don't know, I just found it, I'm sorry. We've been in an accident, my husband is not responding and I can't get anyone to stop. Please, we're on Route 9 past the grain elevator, there's a tree with a yellow reflector on it, we went off the road just past that, please." "Mom," I said, already slowing down, "I need you to stay on the line with me. Is your husband breathing?" There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I'm scared to check." "Okay, I'm a paramedic. I'm turning around right now. What's your name?" "Claire," she said. "Please hurry. I think it's been a while." Nobody stopped. I had already pulled a U-turn on the empty highway. My training kicked in the way it always does, clinical, systematic, the personal feelings sliding into a back compartment to be dealt with later. I told Claire to keep talking to me, to tell me if anything changed with her husband, to stay as still as possible if she thought she might be injured. She answered in short, quiet sentences. Her voice never broke, but I could hear how much effort that was costing her. I asked her again about the yellow reflector on the tree. She confirmed it. I asked roughly how far past the grain elevator, and she said she thought maybe a quarter mile, maybe a little less. I knew Route 9 reasonably well. I'd driven it hundreds of times. I knew the grain elevator she meant an old structure that had been out of use for years, sitting back from the road with a faded company name on the side. I'd always noticed it as a landmark. "I'm about 8 minutes out," I told her. "Stay on the line." She did. Or at least I thought she did. The call didn't drop. I could see it was still connected on the screen, but her voice became harder to hear. Not static exactly. More like she was moving further away from the phone or speaking more quietly than before. I kept talking, kept giving her instructions, telling her I was almost there, asking her to say something if she could hear me. Every few seconds I'd get a sound, a breath, a soft syllable, something that told me the line was still live. When I saw the grain elevator, I slowed way down and started scanning the right side of the road. The sky was pale gray by then, not quite sunrise, just enough light to see the ditch lines and the tree line beyond. I was watching for a vehicle, for any sign of disturbance in the gravel shoulder, for tire marks, for anything. I found the tree with the yellow reflector exactly where she'd described it. I pulled over completely, got out of my car, and stood in the cold morning air looking at the area just past it. There was nothing there. I mean that in the most literal sense. The ground was undisturbed. The grass in the shallow ditch was flat and uniformly frost-covered, the way it gets when nothing has touched it overnight. There were no skid marks on the asphalt, no broken fence posts, no scattered debris. Nothing that suggested a vehicle had gone off the road at any point in the recent past. I looked at my phone. The call was still connected. The timer read 41 minutes. "Claire," I said, "I'm at the location. I'm right here. Where are you?" Nothing. Not even breathing this time. I walked the full shoulder from the tree to about 200 yards in each direction, checking the ditch on both sides. I went into the tree line maybe 30 feet, pushing through the brush, half expecting to find a vehicle hidden in the underbrush. My shoes were soaked through, my hands were numb. I found nothing, not a tire track, not a piece of broken glass, not a single indicator that anything had happened here. I called 911. I felt somewhat ridiculous doing it, I'll be honest with you. I'm a paramedic. I spend my working life on the other end of that line, but I didn't know what else to do. I told the dispatcher exactly what had happened, the call, the woman named Claire, the location she described, my search of the area. The dispatcher asked me to stay put and said she'd send a unit. While I waited, I tried calling the unknown number back. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail with no recorded greeting, just an automated prompt to leave a message. I didn't leave one. 2 deputies arrived about 15 minutes later. I walked them through everything, showed them where I'd searched, told them about the call, played back what little of it I could reconstruct from memory. They were professional about it. Didn't make me feel like I was wasting their time, at least not openly. One of them walked the ditch line with a flashlight, even though it was almost fully light by then. The other one was on his radio running something through dispatch. It was that second deputy who came back to me with an expression I didn't immediately know how to read. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "The woman on the phone, she said her name was Claire." "That's right." "Did she give you a last name?" "No, I didn't get one." He was quiet for a moment. "And she said Route 9, past the grain elevator near a tree with a yellow reflector." "Word for word, pretty much." He turned and looked at the tree, then looked back at me. "There was an accident here," he said. "Right in this spot, 3 days ago." I remember the cold hitting me differently when he said that, not the temperature, the feeling. "A vehicle went off the road sometime in the evening," he continued. "We think around 8 or 9 p.m., based on the witness account, but the witness only reported it the next morning. By the time we got here, the vehicle had already been recovered by the family." He paused. "Both occupants were pronounced at the scene." I heard what he was saying, but my brain was doing that thing where it refuses to assemble the pieces into their obvious shape. "Both occupants," I repeated. "A married couple. The wife was identified as Claire Ostrowski, 31 years old." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I was looking at the frost on the grass in the ditch, perfectly undisturbed, and trying to find some other explanation for what I was holding in my head. "The number that called me," I said finally. "The unknown number. Is there any way to—" "We can request the call log from your carrier," he said. "That would at least confirm the call happened. Give us the originating number." He said it matter-of-factly, but something in his tone told me he was not entirely sure what he was going to find. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for about 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I didn't sleep that day, which, given everything I'd been through in the past 24+ hours, was fairly remarkable. The call log came back 4 days later. I know this because the detective who followed up the case had been passed along by that point, called me in the afternoon to tell me what they'd found. He was careful about how he worded things. The way you are when you know the information you're giving someone doesn't fit inside any available framework. There had been a call made to my number at 6:17 a.m. on the morning in question, 41 minutes in duration, matching exactly what my phone showed. The originating number belonged to a cell phone registered to Claire Ostrowski. That phone had been recovered from the accident scene 3 days earlier. It had been bagged into evidence. It had been in a locked property room at the county sheriff's office since the evening of the recovery. The detective said, and I could tell he was reading carefully from notes, the way you do when you want to get the words exactly right, that there was no technical explanation he could offer for how a call of that duration had been made from a phone in a sealed evidence bag. He said the phone's carrier had been contacted and they had no explanation either. He said he was telling me this not because they had any theory about what happened, but because he felt I deserved to know what the record showed. He asked if I had any questions. I said I didn't. I've thought about that conversation almost every day since. I've thought about Claire's voice, how calm she was trying to be, how frightened she was underneath the calm. I've thought about the 41 minutes I spent talking to her, trying to get to her, and whether any part of what I was doing actually reached her in whatever sense mattered. I've thought about the man we lost on that shift before any of this happened. and about the strange weight of a job that exists entirely inside the gap between one state and another. I'm not going to tell you what I believe about what happened that night because honestly I don't know. I've never been a particularly religious or superstitious person, and I'm not about to become one because of a phone call I can't explain. What I will say is this: if you ever get a call from an unknown number that you're not sure you should pick it up, answer it, and if someone on the other end needs help, you go. Whatever is happening, whatever you've been through that day, whatever logic tells you about what's possible, you just go. I still work the same route. I still pass that grain elevator every morning when I'm heading home. I still notice the tree with the yellow reflector, and I still slow down every single time I pass it, even when I'm exhausted, even when I just want to be home. I slow down and I look the same way I looked that morning, and so far there's never been anything there. So far. We continue. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 38 years old, originally from a small town in eastern Ohio, though I've been living in New England for the past 12 years. I work, or I used to work, I should say, since things have changed somewhat, since the incident as a night security officer at Whitmore University. During the years this story covers, I was assigned specifically to the Hargrove Memorial Library, which is one of the larger academic libraries in the northeastern United States and, depending on who you ask, one of the most beautiful buildings on campus. I want to establish something clearly before I begin. I am not a superstitious person. I was raised in a practical household. My father was an electrician. My mother taught 5th grade for 30 years. I have never believed in ghosts, in apparitions, or in any of the things I'm about to describe. I want to be honest with you. I still don't entirely know what to make of what happened, and I've spent a considerable amount of time in the months since trying to find a rational explanation for each individual piece of it. I haven't found one that covers all of them simultaneously, and that bothers me more than the events themselves in a way, because I'm the kind of person who needs things to add up. So I'm telling this story because it needs to be told, not because I enjoy telling it. You can decide what you think happened. The Hargrove Memorial Library was built in the 1920s, all limestone and carved stone detailing, the kind of building that was designed to communicate permanence and seriousness. During the day, it's crowded with students, loud with the particular noise of young people pretending to study, full of life in the slightly chaotic way that large university buildings always are. At night, after we lock the exterior doors at 11, it becomes something entirely different. The sound changes. Your footsteps echo off the marble floors in ways that seem almost deliberate, like the building is reminding you that it has been standing a long time and will continue standing long after you've gone. The reading rooms, which during the day smell of coffee and chalk and people, smell at night of old paper and wood varnish and something else I could never quite name, something cold and still, like the inside of a stone church. I worked the overnight shift alone. That was unusual for a building of that size, but the university had gone through 2 rounds of budget cuts in 3 years, and the overnight security staff for the library had been reduced from 3 people to 1. Nobody had complained loudly enough to change it, and honestly, after a few months, I preferred it. I'm not a particularly social person by nature, and there is something deeply peaceful about being alone in a large, quiet building at 3 in the morning. My responsibilities were straightforward. 2 complete walkthroughs per hour, checking that all exterior doors were properly locked and alarmed, monitoring the camera feed from the main security desk on the ground floor, logging any incidents, any attempted entries, any equipment failures, responding to alarms. In 4 years on that shift, I had never once responded to anything more serious than a stuck bathroom window that triggered a sensor. The library had 6 floors above ground, plus a basement level. The basement was what the staff called the Special Collections Archive, a restricted section that housed the university's rarest holdings: fragile manuscripts, historical records donated by local estates and historical societies, and the university's own institutional archives going back to its founding in 1887. Access to the archive required a specially encoded keycard, and during regular hours, only approved faculty members and a small rotating group of doctoral researchers were permitted entry. The collection was partially climate-controlled, which made it noticeably colder than the rest of the building, and the ceiling was lower than on the upper floors, which gave the whole area a slightly compressed, pressurized feeling, like the inside of a vault. I want to say that the first time I noticed the light, I did my job properly and went immediately downstairs to investigate, but that would make me sound more attentive than I actually was that night. The truth is, the first time I noticed it, I was on the second floor doing my midnight round, and I happened to glance down through the stairwell at the right angle to see a faint amber glow visible through the narrow rectangular window set into the archive door at the basement level. I assumed it was nothing. A timer on a security light maybe. A sensor left in an active state. Something with a mundane mechanical explanation. I noted it in my log as procedure required and continued my walkthrough. The second time I noticed it, perhaps 3 weeks later, I did the same thing. Noted it, kept walking, and the third time something made me stop. I went down. The archive door was locked, as it was always supposed to be. I pressed my face to the narrow window and looked inside. The room ran about 40 feet deep, with metal shelving units on both sides holding grey archival boxes in long rows, and at the far end 3 wooden reading tables positioned under pendant lights. The amber glow I had seen from upstairs was coming from the pendant light over the middle table. At that table sat a young man. He appeared to be in his mid-20s. He was slim, not unhealthily so, just naturally slight-framed, and was wearing a plain dark sweater. He had a large spiral-bound notebook open in front of him, and was writing with considerable speed and focus, not looking up. He had dark brown hair that fell slightly forward over his forehead as he bent over the page, and he wore glasses with thin wire frames. He was biting the inside of his cheek very slightly, the way people do when they're concentrating on getting something exactly right. He looked in every single particular like a graduate student in the middle of a late-night study session. He looked perfectly, almost aggressively, normal. I knocked on the door. He looked up immediately. When he saw me, his expression shifted not to panic, not to the guilty alarm you'd expect from someone caught somewhere they shouldn't be, but to something closer to embarrassment, the mild kind, like someone caught eating in a no-food zone. He held up one finger, the universal signal for just one moment, closed his notebook carefully, and walked toward the door. He opened it. I noticed that the lock had not been forced or tampered with in any visible way. "I'm really sorry," he said, before I could say anything. He had a quiet, deliberate way of speaking, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who thinks carefully before opening his mouth. "I know I'm not supposed to be in here after hours. I have a key card and I have legitimate access through Professor Halliwell's research cohort, but I know it's past 11. I just needed more time with some of the 1943 documents. I was going to be done in an hour." I told him that it didn't matter whether he had a key card. The archive was off limits to everyone without exception after library closing. I told him I needed to see his student ID and that I'd be writing up the incident. He produced his ID without hesitation or argument. His name was Thomas Wren. The photo matched him completely. Same face, same glasses, same slightly formal posture. He was listed as a doctoral candidate in the Department of History. I wrote the incident report, gave him the standard formal warning which included notice that repeat violations could result in suspension of his library access privileges, and walked him out through the main entrance. He apologized twice more during the walk, asked once whether the write-up would be forwarded to his faculty advisor, and thanked me when I held the door. At the bottom of the front steps, he turned up his collar against the November cold, tucked the notebook under his arm, and walked away across the plaza. I thought about him briefly the following day, then put him out of my mind entirely. He was back approximately a month later. This time I went downstairs as soon as I saw the light. I knocked and he came to the door almost at once, same sweater, same notebook, same mildly embarrassed expression. "Thomas," I said. "I know," he said. He didn't wait for me to finish. "I know, I'm almost done. I genuinely mean that I can see the shape of the whole argument now. I just need a few more sessions with the deed records from 1943 and 1944. Once I have those, the thesis is essentially complete." I asked him why he couldn't access the material during regular archive hours when access was permitted. He paused, seemed to consider the question seriously. "The collection is only partially catalogued," he said. "About 60% of the boxes have been indexed. The rest are still in their original order from when they were donated. When there are other researchers in here and the staff are occupied, there isn't anyone to help me navigate the uncatalogued section. It takes a long time to locate specific items. At night I can work through them methodically without taking anyone's time." He paused again. "I understand that's not an adequate justification for being here. I'm not arguing with you. I just want you to understand why." There was something about the way he explained things that I found difficult to argue with. Not because he was manipulative or persuasive in a calculated way. It was more that he seemed genuinely unconcerned with how his situation appeared, focused entirely on what he was doing and why it mattered. He didn't seem like someone who was breaking rules for entertainment or convenience. He seemed like someone who had run out of other options. I wrote the second incident report. I reminded him that a second violation would almost certainly result in escalation to his department. He nodded, thanked me, and left. The third time he appeared, I stopped in the doorway and asked him to tell me about the research. He looked slightly surprised, then pleased. He set down his pen and told me about his thesis. He was investigating a series of land transactions in our county, dating from 1938 to 1951, which he believed had been part of a coordinated and systematic effort to dispossess several black farming families of land they had legally owned on the western edge of what was now the university's main campus. He had been working on it for 3 years. He spoke about it with a quality I can only describe as weight, not performance, not academic excitement, but the quiet urgency of someone who has spent a very long time on something they believe is genuinely important. He mentioned a man named Raymond Coates, who had owned 82 acres of farmland until 1944, when he lost the property through a tax proceeding that Thomas believed had been fraudulently constructed. Raymond's grandchildren still live here, he said. About 4 miles from here. They don't know any of this happened. Nobody does, really. It's not in any history of this county. It's not in any academic record. The only evidence that any of it occurred is in those boxes downstairs, in documents that no one has looked at in 30 or 40 years. He picked up his pen again. That's why I need to finish. I remember standing in the corridor thinking that it was in fact a good reason. I still wrote up the incident. The fourth time he appeared, something was different. I had come downstairs earlier than usual. Something had caught my eye in the camera feed. A quality of shadow near the archive door that seemed marginally wrong to me. Though when I reviewed the footage afterward, I couldn't identify anything specific. I went down and looked through the window. Thomas was at the table writing, the pendant light casting its small circle of amber across the page. But this time the notebook in front of him was nearly full. I could see the thick sheaf of completed pages bulging outward from the spine, pages dense with his careful, compact handwriting. I knocked. He looked up, and in the moment before the familiar expression settled onto his face, I saw something I hadn't seen in the previous 3 encounters, something that at the time I labeled in my mind as exhaustion, but which in retrospect I think was something else. Relief maybe, or a kind of completion. He opened the door. "I think I'm finished," he said. I looked at him. He was paler than I'd seen him before, and his eyes had a slightly unfocused quality, the way someone looks after very many hours of close concentration. "Or nearly finished," he amended. "I found the deed records I needed. The whole argument holds. The documentation is there." He closed the notebook and held it for a moment with both hands, the way you might hold something fragile. I told him, same as always, that I needed to walk him out. He nodded. At the main entrance, I typed in the code and pushed the door open. He stepped through, then turned back. "Can I ask you something?" I said he could. "If my thesis ever gets submitted, would you look up Raymond Coates, just to see whether it made a difference?" The phrasing was odd, not when, but if. I told him I would. He thanked me again, by name, and walked down the steps and across the plaza. It was a clear night, very cold, the kind of cold that makes the air itself seem sharp. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. His breath made no mark in the air. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, trying to understand what I had just noticed. Then I went back inside, sat down at the security desk, and looked at the blank incident report form on the screen for a very long time before I started typing. Before I left the following morning, I stopped at the library administration office at 7:30 and asked the duty administrator whether she could look up a student named Thomas Wren, doctoral candidate in history, in connection with several archive access violations I had logged. She looked at me with an expression I didn't immediately understand. She asked me to spell the name. I spelled it. She typed something, looked at her screen, and then looked back at me. She asked me to follow her to her desk, where she turned the monitor toward me without saying anything. It was the university's memorial page for Thomas Wren. His photograph, the same face, the same wire-framed glasses, the same slight tilt of the head, the dates below his name, 1994 to 2022. A brief text describing him as a devoted scholar and gifted researcher, and below that, 2 paragraphs explaining what had happened. Thomas Wren had died 23 months earlier. He had been working late in the Special Collections Archive. He had formal after-hours clearance at the time, approved by his faculty advisor for the duration of a research deadline, when a gas leak from a faulty heating unit in the basement mechanical room had filled the archive space while he was working alone at the table. The maintenance crew had found him the following morning. He had been there for approximately 7 hours. In response to the incident, the university had revoked all individual after-hours access to the archive, upgraded the basement ventilation system, and reached a private settlement with Thomas's family. I read the page 3 times. Then I thanked the administrator and walked out into the morning, into the cold air, where my breath was perfectly visible, white against the grey November sky, the way it was supposed to be. I took 2 days off and told my supervisor I was ill. When I came back, I requested a transfer to a different building. He asked if something had happened. I said no, that I needed a change of routine. He approved it, and I haven't been back to the Hargrove Library since. Before I left, I did one thing. I went to the history department office and told the secretary that I had recovered a spiral notebook from the Special Collections Archive during a routine security check, and that it appeared to contain research notes. I had the notebook in a plastic bag, logged as found property. I don't know why I hadn't formally logged it before. I hadn't been able to bring myself to. The secretary looked through it briefly and then went to find someone. She came back with Dr. Halliwell, a tall woman in her 50s whose name I recognized from the faculty photos on the wall. Dr. Halliwell sat down and began reading. She read for a long time. The office was quiet around her. When she finally looked up, her voice was very controlled. "Where did you find this?" I told her, "Archive Table 3, Lost Property." She looked at me steadily. "This is Thomas's handwriting. This is his thesis, the section he hadn't finished yet. The legal analysis of the court's transactions, the secondary source framework, and the family history documentation." She turned a few more pages. "This is essentially complete. With some editorial work and proper academic formatting, this could be submitted." She set the notebook down very carefully, the way you set down something that matters. "Do you know what this would mean for the Coates family?" I told her I had some idea. I left shortly after. I did look up Raymond Coates, as I had promised. 8 months after Thomas Wren's death, a short article appeared in our county's Historical Society newsletter. It described how an anonymous research contribution to the Whitmore History Department had enabled the identification of a group of families whose farmland had been taken through fraudulent tax proceedings during the 1940s. Several families were named. The Coates family was among them. The article noted that a civil rights legal foundation had been contacted about the historical record and was reviewing the documentation. Thomas Wren was not named anywhere in the article. His family, I learned later, had asked for that. I have told this story to a few people I trust. The responses have been more or less what you would expect. Some suggest I imagined it, that I was overtired, that I confused someone else for a dead man, that my mind constructed the resemblance afterward. Others don't try to explain it at all. One person, someone who has thought about these things more carefully than I have, told me that perhaps what matters is not the mechanism of how something happened, but whether it needed to happen and whether someone allowed it to. I don't have a clean explanation. I know what I saw across 4 separate nights. I know what I found on that table. I know what was written in that notebook in Thomas Wren's careful, unhurried handwriting, his argument completed, his documentation in order, the names of the Coates family and a dozen others preserved in ink on paper in a room where he had died alone 2 years before. And I know that when he walked out of the library on that last night in air cold enough to make every breath visible, his left none. That is everything I can tell you. I've kept my promise to look up Raymond Coates. I'd like to think Thomas knows that. We continue, and I don't quite know how to begin this, which is strange because I've been turning it over in my mind for 4 years now, trying to find a first sentence that does it justice. The truth is, there may not be one. Some things resist being contained in a sentence, some things resist being contained at all. What I can tell you is that the worst of it happened 4 years ago, but that the real beginning was in the summer of 2002, when my twin brother Owen disappeared from our grandmother's property in a hollow outside Cookeville, Tennessee. He was 9 years old, so was I. We shared a birthday July 11th, and that summer we'd spent it at Nana Rose's place. a white clapboard farmhouse sitting on 40 acres that had been in our family since my great-grandfather Eldon Carver acquired it in the 1930s. The land was beautiful if you didn't know its history. Rolling green hills, a creek that ran cold even in July, old-growth oaks that made the sky feel smaller and closer, like a quilt pulled down over the world. Out behind the vegetable garden and the tire swing, there was an old stone well sealed with a heavy iron grate that had supposedly been dry since before anyone in the family could remember. We'd been told never to go near it. Nana Rose was clear on that, not frightening clear, just final clear, the kind of voice that lets you know questions aren't part of the arrangement. That well is nobody's business. We accepted it the way children accept most adult prohibitions, completely for about a week, and then imperfectly forever after. Owen was the kind of boy who made friends with everything: stray dogs, elderly neighbors, afternoon rain. He had a gap between his front teeth that made his grin look lopsided, like his face couldn't quite contain how happy he was. He carried his Red Sox baseball glove everywhere, a catcher's mitt, child-sized, worn soft at the thumb from 100 hours of catch in our backyard. He slept with it tucked under his arm. He brought it to the dinner table. Our mother used to pretend to be exasperated about it, but I could tell she found it funny. I teased him constantly, the way you tease the person you love most when you're 9 years old and don't have any other vocabulary for it. He'd written his name on the inside of the glove in black marker, the letters uneven but deliberate, O-N-C. That was Owen. On the morning of August 3rd, 2002, our cousin Darren, 12 years old, the kind of age where you're old enough to feel responsible for younger kids, but not old enough to actually be responsible, suggested we go explore the back of the property. It was just past 7 in the morning, the air still cool, the sky that particular cloudless blue you only get in Tennessee before the heat arrives. Nana Rose was in the kitchen. My mother was asleep after working a double shift the week before. My father had stopped being part of the equation the previous Christmas, and that's all I'll say about him. Darren, Owen, and I walked out through the long grass past the garden, toward the oak grove and beyond. I remember dew soaking through the canvas of my sneakers. I remember a mockingbird doing impressions somewhere in the branches above us. Cardinal, blue jay, something else I couldn't identify. Its whole identity a kind of cheer for borrowed theft. What happened next is something I've reconstructed almost entirely from what Darren told the police that afternoon, because my own memory of it stops being reliable right around that moment. I had fallen a little behind them. I'd stopped to watch a yellow butterfly resting on a blackberry branch, and Darren and Owen had gotten ahead of me, close enough to the well that they could see the iron grate. Darren said Owen knelt down to look through the grate. Darren said he stood back. Darren said Owen spoke his name. Just once, flat, not frightened, not excited. Just Darren, like he was reading from a list. And then Darren said something came through the grate. He couldn't describe it. He tried 4 different times across 2 police interviews and never got closer than a hand, but not a hand, too long, too dark, darker than shade. He said it reached up and touched Owen's face. Darren ran. He says he ran and didn't look back, and I believe him absolutely. He was 12 years old. By the time we returned to the well with Nana Rose and then the first police officers, Owen was gone. The search lasted 2 days. Volunteers came from town. Someone brought dogs, and I sat on the porch steps watching them work the long grass with their noses down, thinking with perfect childlike certainty that this was all a mistake, that Owen was about to come around the corner of the farmhouse with that lopsided grin and his glove held up like a trophy, and whatever the grown-ups were so upset about would dissolve in the fact of him standing there. They found him on the 2nd day. The iron grate over the well had been moved. The police spent time puzzling over this because it took 2 adult officers working together to lift it, and there was no good explanation. The well that was supposed to be dry wasn't. There was 6 feet of black water at the bottom, cold even in August, and Owen was in it. I won't describe what they found beyond that. The official cause of death was drowning. Nana Rose fainted when the officers told her. My mother made a sound I had never heard from a human being before and have spent 22 years trying to unhear. No one was ever charged. There was an investigation, and then there wasn't. Darren's account of what he had seen at the grate was noted in the police report as witness statements consistent with shock-induced perceptual distortion. I found a copy of that report when I was 19 and have thought about that phrase many times since. Owen was buried at the cemetery behind First Baptist in Cookville. We put his Red Sox glove in the casket with him, tucked under his right arm the way he always carried it. It seemed important. I didn't understand why at the time, and I'm not sure I understand now, except that some objects become so bound up with a person that separating them feels like a second death. The years after that were hard in the way years can be when the ground drops out from under a family and everyone has to keep walking anyway, pretending there's still something solid underfoot. My mother struggled. She wasn't a bad person. She was a person who had lost the one thing she couldn't survive losing and had to survive it regardless. My grandmother closed off the back section of the property with a fence and never went near the well again. Darren moved away when he turned 18 and we fell out of contact. Though I heard later that he'd married, had 2 kids, built as much distance as geographically possible between himself and the summer of 2002. I don't blame him for any of it. As for me, I drove trucks. I got my CDL at 23 and the work suited me in a way nothing else had since I was 9 years old. The highway is demanding but honest. It asks that you pay attention. It asks that you stay in your lane, watch your mirrors, respect the weight behind you. There's a meditative quality to a long haul that most people who've never done it wouldn't understand. The white dashes coming at you in a steady rhythm like something breathing. The radio a companion rather than a distraction. I ran routes mostly through the Southeast, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, sometimes Alabama, and up into Virginia. I was good at it. My dispatchers liked me because I was on time and I didn't complain. It let me think. It let me be alone in a way that felt chosen rather than imposed. I was 31 years old and had been working for a carrier out of Nashville for 3 years when I first saw Owen on the side of the road. I was coming back from a delivery in Sparta, running a stretch of Highway 70 through White County in late October. It was maybe 4 in the afternoon, and that slanted fall light that turns everything gold and slightly mournful. The road was empty in both directions. Trees pressed close on either side, the leaves already half gone, the branches making complicated shadows across the asphalt. I saw a figure on the shoulder, a child small, standing completely still. You're always slow for a child alone near a highway. I slowed. I leaned forward toward the windshield, and as I came closer, the figure resolved out of distance and laid light into something with a specific shape. A boy in a red jacket holding something at his side, something brown and round. A baseball glove. I hit the brakes. I sat in the cab for what felt like a long time with the engine running and my hands tight on the wheel, telling myself that I was tired, that the light was deceptive, that 22 years of grief had finally found a way to project itself onto a stranger child standing 200 feet away. I told myself all of that and then I got out anyway. There was no one on the shoulder. Just gravel and dead leaves and the sound of the mockingbirds starting up in the trees the moment I stepped out of the cab, loud and overlapping, every one of them imitating something else. I stood there until the cold got into my jacket. Then I got back in the truck and drove. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of light and longing. I believed this for approximately 3 weeks. I found the glove on my passenger seat on a Monday morning in mid-November. My truck had been locked in the freight yard all weekend. I know this because I had personally locked it Friday evening, checked the door twice the way I always do, and walked to my car across a yard monitored by 2 security cameras. When I climbed into the cab Monday morning and tossed my coffee thermos onto the passenger seat, the glove was already there. A Red Sox catcher's mitt, child-sized, worn soft at the thumb. The name on the inside in uneven black marker that had faded but was still legible, ONC. I sat in that cab for a very long time. I'm not someone who cries easily, and I want to be straightforward about the fact that I cried. I took the glove to my mother that same afternoon. She went pale when she saw it, not the kind of pale that's a reaction so much as a withdrawal, the body pulling its blood somewhere safer. She sat down at the kitchen table without being asked, and looked at it for a long time without touching it. "That's Owen's," she said finally. "I know," I said. "Callie." She looked up at me. "Something's been happening here too." She told me she'd been waking in the night without knowing why. Not from dreams, or not exactly from dreams, but pulled upright by something she couldn't name. She'd find herself standing in the kitchen or at the back door with no memory of having gotten there. Once, she said, she'd woken up sitting in her car in the driveway with the radio on, playing a melody she almost recognized, something half remembered from a distance, and her hands already on the steering wheel. I called Nana Rose that evening. She was 84 and still living alone on the Cookville property, which she had refused to leave for reasons she never fully explained. She sounded sharp on the phone, sharpened by age rather than dulled. When I mentioned the glove, she went quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Come out here," she said. "Come soon, Callie." I drove to the farmhouse the following Saturday. Nana Rose made coffee the way she always had, strong enough to stand up to argument, and we sat at her kitchen table in the good quiet of an old house that knows how to hold silence without it becoming oppressive. She told me things she'd never told me before. My great-grandfather Eldon Carver had not come by the property honestly. The land had belonged to 3 black farming families who had worked it since Reconstruction. Good families, she said, with deep roots and a right to what they'd built. In the Depression years, Eldon had manipulated the debt those families carried, forced one sale through legal pressure that wasn't quite legal, cheated the other 2 outright with doctored papers, and a county clerk he'd paid off. One family, the Stillwater family, whose name also belonged to the creek that ran through the property, had not left quietly. The patriarch, a man named Absalom Stillwater, had gone to the well before they were removed from the land. He'd spoken over it. What exactly, Nana Rose didn't know, or said she didn't. But the meaning of what he'd done was this: this water is still ours. What comes from this water returns to us. I always knew something walked the edges of this property, she told me, her coffee cup held in both hands. I saw it through the years, a shape that wasn't quite a shadow, moving where it shouldn't be. I never named it to anyone because some things don't shrink when you name them. Some things only get more real. She looked at me steadily across the table. I believe it's been waiting for a reckoning, Callie. Something that got started needs to get finished. I drove home that evening with the glove on my passenger seat and a sensation in my chest like a watch spring wound too tight. 11 days later, at 3:30 in the morning, my phone woke me. It was my mother's neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, an older woman who'd lived next door for 15 years and who did not call people at 3 in the morning for nothing. She'd looked out her bedroom window and seen my mother in the backyard in her nightgown, walking toward the tree line at the far end of the subdivision. She'd called out from her window, she said, and my mother hadn't turned, hadn't paused, had only continued walking with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knows exactly where they're going. I was 90 minutes away. I drove the whole stretch at speeds that I won't specify. I found my mother at the edge of a retention pond behind the subdivision, a grey concrete basin that had no poetry to it, no resemblance to a Tennessee creek, nothing that should have meant anything to anyone. But it was water. She was standing at the edge with her feet in the shallow, still in her nightgown, arms loose at her sides, eyes open and fixed on something I couldn't see. I screamed her name. I grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back from the water, and she came back in stages, like someone surfacing from very deep under layers of consciousness, reassembling themselves one at a time. When she finally focused on my face, she lifted her hand and touched my cheek. "I heard him," she whispered. "I heard Owen calling." Her hand was so cold. I wrapped my arms around her and held on. When I finally looked down, I saw what was knotted around her wrist, a piece of dark leather cord. The wrist strap from Owen's baseball glove, the glove I had left locked in my truck 2 miles away. I don't know what Nana Rose did that afternoon on the back porch of the Cookville farmhouse, with my mother seated across from her and the property spread out around them, the sealed well somewhere beyond the fence line, the old oak standing over everything. I was told to stay in the kitchen, and I did. I heard Nana Rose's voice for almost 2 hours, low and rhythmic, not quite words I could make out, a sound more like intention than language. I smelled something burning, green and resinous, drifting through the screen door. Once my mother cried out a single sound, not pain exactly, more like release, and then silence settled back over everything and stayed. When they came inside, my mother looked the way you look when a fever finally breaks, emptied of something that had been taking up space. Nana Rose set food in front of both of us and told us to eat, and that we should go home, and that we shouldn't return to the property for a while. I asked her what she had done. She looked at me with her 84-year-old eyes, clear as creek water. "I gave back what was owed," she said. "Sometimes that's all there is to do." Nana Rose died 11 weeks later, in her sleep, in her own bed, in her own house on the property she had lived on for 60 years. Her heart simply stopped, the doctor said. She was 84 years old and she had lived a full and complicated life, and her death was the kind that should feel like peace. Mostly it did, except that I kept thinking about what she had said. I gave back what was owed, and the way she'd said it, like a person who knew they were paying a price. My mother held my hand through the funeral service and didn't let go once. She looked lighter than she had in years, honestly steady in a way I hadn't seen since before Owen died. She slept through the night now and stopped waking in the kitchen. She no longer walked toward water. The glove was gone from my truck when I went back to work. The leather strap was gone from my mother's wrist. I never saw either of them again. I still drive. It's the work that fits me, and I think it always will. I'm more careful now than I used to be. I check my mirrors more. I pay closer attention to what stands beside the road in the hours before dawn, when the highway gets quiet and the distance between headlights stretches out and you're alone in a way that teaches you things about yourself, whether you want to learn them or not. There's one last thing I want to record because I've told this story before and I always stop before this part, and I think I stop because I don't know what to do with it. But it belongs here. The night Nana Rose died, I was driving a return route up through White County on Highway 70. I was passing the stretch where I'd first seen the boy on the shoulder, where the trees lean close and the road curves slightly and the silence has a particular quality I've never experienced anywhere else. It was dark. There was nothing on the shoulder. But when I reached forward to adjust the radio, there was a piece of paper on the dashboard that I was certain had not been there when I got in. A folded piece of notebook paper. I pulled onto the shoulder and opened it under the cab light. It was a child's drawing. Crayon on notebook paper, the lines uneven and confident the way a 9-year-old's lines are. A white farmhouse with a crooked chimney, green hills and a creek running through them. Stick figures standing in front of the house holding hands more than I could easily count. A long chain of them stretching to the edge of the paper and presumably beyond. No names, no date, nothing written at all. I kept it. I carry it in the glove compartment of every truck I drive, folded twice, in the same place I'd keep something I couldn't explain and wasn't ready to put down. I've read enough now to understand some of what happened to my family, how grief becomes a door, how old wrongs stay open like wounds until someone finally closes them, how the things that follow us most relentlessly are the things we've never made right. My great-grandfather Eldon Carver took something that didn't belong to him, and that taking left a seam in the fabric of everything my family built on top of it. Nana Rose closed it the only way it could be closed, by giving back what the land had been asking for. I don't know what that cost her. I know she didn't tell me. I know my mother is still here, sleeping through the night in her own house, waking to make coffee and call me on Sundays. I know that Darren reached out to me last spring, cautiously, the way you reach out to someone when you're not sure the bridge is still there, and that we've been talking again, slowly building something back. I know that Owen would have been 31 this past July. I think about what kind of man he would have been, what kind of laugh he would have had, whether he'd still have carried that ridiculous glove. I think the mockingbirds know what happened. I think that's why they keep following me. I still hear them on certain stretches of highway and certain kinds of light. I still slow down when I see a child standing alone near the road. I still check my mirrors. And every time I reach into the glove compartment for a pen or a receipt or anything at all, my fingers find that folded piece of notebook paper first. The stick figures holding hands in a chain that goes off the edge of the page, and I think about all the people in my family who are gone now, and all the ones who are still here, and how thin the line between those two things has always been. Nana Rose knew how thin it was. She walked right up to it and did what needed doing anyway. I'm grateful for that every single day. I try to be worthy of it. We continue. There are certain things you learn when you work the night shift long enough. You learn that silence has its own texture, that the quiet of 2 a.m. feels fundamentally different from the quiet of 4, heavier somehow, like the air itself has gotten denser while the rest of the world was asleep. You learn to trust your gut in ways you never had to during the day when everything is loud and lit and surrounded by other people. And you learn, maybe most importantly, that the things that make you uneasy in the middle of the night are almost always the things you should have paid more attention to from the very beginning. I want you to understand all of that before I tell you what happened, because context matters. I need you to know what my state of mind was, what my job was like, what kind of person I was before any of this started. I'm not the type to get spooked by small things. I've worked nights for the better part of a decade across 3 different jobs, and I have seen enough genuinely strange situations with rational explanations. I mean that I developed what I'd call a high threshold for alarm. Something has to get past that threshold before I take it seriously. What I'm about to tell you got past it, way past it. My name is Owen Bradley, And for the past 4 years, I have been working the overnight shift at Clearview Self-Storage, which is one of those large storage facility complexes you find on the outskirts of mid-sized cities, the kind with 3 floors of climate-controlled units, a glass-fronted security booth at the entrance, and cameras covering every inch of the property, including the stairwells, the parking lot, both loading docks, and all 3-floor corridors. We are technically open 24 hours. The office staff clocks out at 10 in the evening though, and from 10 until 6 the next morning, it's just me in that booth with the monitors, the radio, a thermos that I refill twice a night, and whatever mood the building decides to be in. Most people don't use storage facilities at 3 in the morning, and when they do, there's usually a perfectly reasonable explanation. The man clearing out his late father's unit because he can't bring himself to do it during the day when people might see him cry. The woman who just left her husband and needs to retrieve documents she had the foresight to store somewhere he couldn't access. A small restaurant owner rotating dry goods between locations because that's the only window he has. Night people mostly. People in the middle of something difficult. People with things they need to put somewhere safe and quiet until they figure out what to do next. I had seen enough of that kind of customer that I stopped being surprised by any of it. Which is why when Claire Holloway first walked up to my booth on a Thursday night at the end of October, I wasn't alarmed. Not right away. It was 5 minutes to 1 in the morning. The temperature had dropped sharply that week. We were a few days from November, and the cold that particular year had arrived early and mean. And I noticed her before she reached the booth because something in the way she moved caught my eye on the parking lot camera. She was walking steadily across the lot from the direction of the street, not in a hurry, not looking around the way people do when they're nervous about being in a place alone at night. She moved with a kind of focused deliberateness that stands out when the whole world around you is perfectly still. She was a woman in her early 40s, I'd guess. Slim build, dark hair pulled back from her face, wearing a light grey wool coat that did not look warm enough for the weather. I buzzed her in, she walked up to the window, and she gave me her name. I typed it in, the account came up without any flags, and I could see the photo attached to the profile on my screen. It matched. She had a unit on the 3rd floor, Unit 114, climate-controlled, account in good stand with no outstanding balance. I printed a one-time access card, slid it through the window tray, and she picked it up. That was when I felt it. Not dramatically, it was just a brief contact, the kind that happens when you hand something to someone and their fingers brush against yours for a fraction of a second. But her fingers were cold, not the ordinary cold of someone who just walked in from the night air. I mean the kind of cold that makes you pull your hand back slightly before you even realize you've done it, because something in your nervous system registers it as wrong before your brain catches up. I remember thinking she must have been outside for a long time. I remember thinking she should have worn better gloves. She thanked me quietly and walked to the elevator. I tracked her on the monitors. 3rd floor, corridor heading east toward Unit 114, the small LED above the unit door going green, and then the door pulling shut behind her. She was inside for about 22 minutes. Then she came back out, walked the same corridor in reverse, took the elevator down, returned the access card through the drop slot without stopping at the window, and left through the front exit. No conversation, no issues, nothing I'd have any reason to write up in the nightly log. She came back the following Thursday night. Same time, give or take 10 minutes. Same light grey coat, same quiet approach across the parking lot. I almost didn't recognize her face until she was at the window and gave me her name. And then I realized she was the same woman from the week before. Same account, same unit, no flags in the system. I handed her the access card and again felt that same jarring cold. And this time, because I was slightly more alert to it, I watched her hands as she walked away. She kept them at her sides, loose and open. She didn't put them in her pockets, didn't rub them together the way you would if you were genuinely cold. She just walked with that same deliberateness, and I watched her go up to the 3rd floor and into Unit 114, and I kept watching the monitor for the 20 minutes or so she was up there. Here's the thing I've thought about since, the thing I couldn't explain to myself even while I was watching it. That night was cold enough to see your breath outdoors. I could see mine every time I stepped outside for a moment. On the parking lot camera, I watched her walk in, and I could not see her breath. I can be very precise about this because after she left that second Thursday, I replayed the footage 3 times, watching specifically for it. Nothing. The air around her face was perfectly clear. I told myself I had missed it. that it was a camera angle thing or a lighting issue, or that I was too far from the screen to see something that subtle. I told myself a lot of things and went back to my thermos and my radio, and by the end of the shift I had almost convinced myself to stop thinking about it. The third Thursday she didn't come, and I noticed her absence more than I expected to. Not dramatically, I didn't sit there waiting for her or checking the parking lot camera every few minutes. But at some point in the early hours of that shift, I realized she wasn't coming, and I realized that I had, without exactly choosing to, been expecting her. The pattern had established itself, and now it felt like something was missing. I was bothered by that in a way I couldn't entirely justify. On the following Monday, a slow shift, the kind where you've checked everything twice and there's nothing left to do but sit with your thoughts. Something made me pull up her profile in the system again. I genuinely can't tell you why. Maybe it was the gap she'd left. Maybe it was the cold fingers. Maybe it was the breath I couldn't see on the camera playback. Whatever the reason, I opened her file and scrolled through it for no particular purpose. Account active, Unit 114, 3rd floor, climate controlled, monthly fee current, auto-drafted from the account on file. And then, at the bottom of the screen, in the kind of small grey text that you'd miss completely if you weren't scrolling slowly and looking at everything. Account transferred to estate management. Original account holder deceased. Date of transfer, March 14th. I read it 4 times. I read it until the words stopped connecting to meaning the way words do when you repeat them too many times. And then I sat very still in that booth for a long moment, while the building hummed around me and the monitor showed nothing but quiet hallways. March 14th was 7 months ago. Claire Holloway had been dead for 7 months. The 2 Thursday nights she had walked up to my window, the 2 times I had handed her an access card, the 2 times I'd felt those impossibly cold fingers. The 2 nights I had watched her on the 3rd floor camera walking steadily down the corridor to Unit 114 and back. She had been dead for 7 months. I went through every rational explanation I had available. Someone had borrowed her ID and account information. A relative who resembled her closely enough to match the profile photo, a system error that had attached the wrong name to a legitimate visitor. But each explanation unraveled when I pushed on it. Our system requires photo ID verification on accounts flagged for any kind of anomaly, and I had never flagged her account because there was nothing to flag. She had given me her name. I had found the account, the photo matched the face in front of me. I hadn't been fooled by a vague resemblance. I had compared a face to a photograph twice, and both times they were the same person. I did not go to management. I want to be honest about why. I was not sure I could explain what I had seen in a way that didn't end with me being referred to someone in HR for a mental health evaluation. So I said nothing. What I did do was quietly add Unit 114 to my primary camera check rotation, and I started keeping a separate handwritten log of every visitor to that unit. The kind of log I kept for myself and not for the company. She did not come back, but someone else did. It was a Wednesday night in mid-November, just after 11:30. A man approached the booth, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark jacket and moving with the particular kind of confidence that doesn't have anything to do with being friendly. The kind of confidence that is actually closer to indifference. He told me his name was Daniel Reyes and that he was Claire Holloway's brother, and that he needed to access her storage unit to retrieve personal belongings on behalf of the family estate. Everything about him made the hair stand up on my arms before I could identify a single specific reason. It was cumulative and immediate, the way threat sometimes is. I asked for ID. He produced it without hesitation, the way people do when they have rehearsed for that exact question, and the name matched an authorized contact I found in the estate management records attached to Claire's account. Legally, there was nothing preventing me from printing him an access card. I didn't print it. I told him I was required to notify the estate manager for any third-party access requests received after business hours, which was not strictly true, but which sounded credible enough that he accepted it and sat down in the lobby waiting area. I told him it would take a few minutes. He said that was fine. I pretended to make a phone call. What I was actually doing was searching Claire Holloway's name on my phone, held below the level of the counter. The obituary came up in seconds. Claire Holloway, 41 years old, survived by her parents and 1 daughter. No siblings listed, no mention of a brother. The news article that appeared alongside it was 4 paragraphs and had run in the local paper in March. Claire Holloway had been found in her apartment. The circumstances were described as suspicious. The investigation was ongoing. There had been no arrests. I looked up from the phone. On the lobby camera monitor, Daniel Reyes was no longer sitting in the chair. He was standing at the interior door that connects the lobby to the storage corridor, pressing down on the handle and applying slow, testing pressure the way you do when you're checking whether a lock is actually engaged. That door requires a keycard to open from either side. He did not have a keycard. I was reaching for the intercom when I checked the corridor camera on the other side of that door, a habit, automatic, part of my rotation, and my hand stopped. There was someone standing in the corridor. On the other side of a door that had not been opened, standing perfectly still in the center of the hallway, was a figure in a light grey coat. She was not looking at the camera. She was facing the door. I cannot describe to you precisely what I felt in that moment, because what I felt was not a single feeling but several arriving simultaneously, and not all of them had names. What I can tell you is that my hands moved. I reached under the desk and pressed the silent alarm, the one wired directly to the police dispatch line, reserved for genuine emergencies. And then I pressed the intercom. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from that door." He turned toward the lobby camera slowly. Whatever expression he had been wearing before was gone. What replaced it was harder and flatter. "Open the door," he said, not a request. "I can't do that, sir. The estate representative wasn't reachable. We'll need to reschedule." He looked at the lobby door, the exterior one, leading back to the parking lot, and then he looked at the door to the corridor, and I could see him calculating something. Then he reached into his jacket. Every alarm in the building went off at once, not the silent alarm I had pressed, which has no audible component. I mean, every alarm, every motion sensor triggered simultaneously at every door contact alarm in all 3 corridors, the fire suppression warning system, the emergency strobes in the hallway, all of it shrieking and flashing in a single overwhelming wave. The overhead lights in the lobby died. The emergency lighting kicked on, bright and cold and institutional. The noise was absolute. Daniel Reyes ran. He hit the exterior door hard enough that I heard it over the alarms, and he was across the parking lot and through the street entrance before I could have done anything to stop him, even if I'd wanted to. 2 patrol units arrived less than 7 minutes later, responding to the silent alarm. He had made it less than 3 miles before they found him. I gave my statement to the officers that night, and a more formal one 2 days later to detectives who drove out specifically to speak with me. They were careful about what they told me, the way investigators always are when a case is still open, but they confirmed enough. They had been looking for Daniel Reyes in connection with Claire Holloway's death for most of the year. The case had moved significantly forward in the past week, following information that had directed them toward the storage unit. I didn't ask what information. I didn't ask where it had come from. I had a pretty good idea. I never mentioned what I had seen on the corridor camera to the detectives. I told them about the alarms, and they attributed the simultaneous triggering to an electrical fault, a surge in the old wiring. Probably the building was 20 years old, and I let them have that explanation. It was a reasonable one. Before I left at the end of that shift, I went back through the corridor camera footage one more time. I had already reviewed it twice since it happened. The recording quality at night is functional but not perfect. Enough to see clearly, not enough to catch everything. I went through that 30-second window frame by frame, the 30 seconds between when I first checked the hallway and when the alarms went off. Most of the frames show an empty corridor, but in 4 consecutive frames, 4 seconds, covering the period when Daniel Reyes had his hand on that door and was beginning to calculate his next move, there is a figure in the hallway. The camera angle doesn't give you a face, just a grey coat and someone standing very still, and the clear, unmistakable impression of a person who is not going to move out of the way. I saved those 4 frames to a personal drive. I've looked at them many times since. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for when I do. Unit 114 has been empty since December, when the estate finalized and cleared it out. Whatever was in it, whatever she had stored there, whatever she had come back to check on in those 2 quiet Thursday hours is gone. The unit sits empty now, and I pass it on my camera rotation every single night, and it is always just an empty room with white walls and a concrete floor, and a small LED above the door that stays red because no one has any reason to open it. I think about those 2 visits more than I probably should. I think about what she might have known or suspected about what was coming. I think about whether she had already put things in motion before she came back, or whether coming back was itself the thing that set everything in motion. I think about the fact that she never looked directly at me, not really, and I wonder now whether that was consideration on her part Whether she understood somehow that looking at me directly would have frightened me into doing something stupid. I don't pretend to understand how any of it works. I'm a night security guard at a storage facility. Understanding how the dead navigate unfinished business is well outside my area of expertise. What I can tell you is what I observed, and what I observed was this. She came back twice to a place that mattered to her, doing something I couldn't see and didn't understand. And on the night when someone came to use that place against her, to erase the last physical trace of what had been done to her, she was there. She was standing in that hallway, and she did not step aside. I still work the night shift at Clearview. I'll probably work it for another several years until something better comes along, or I get tired of thermoses and quiet hallways. I check that third-floor corridor camera every Thursday night a little longer than I check the others. I can't tell you exactly why. Call it habit, call it respect. I've never seen anything unusual on that camera since, but I'll keep looking. Some things deserve that much at the very least. Some things deserve someone paying attention, even when the hallway is empty and the building is quiet and the rest of the world is sound asleep. That's the whole story. That's all I've got. We continue. I used to tell people that fear was nothing more than the mind's way of filling in blanks. That if you had enough information, enough facts, enough daylight, there was nothing in this world that could make your hands shake the way mine are shaking right now just from telling this story. I am a practical man. I believe in maintenance schedules and road conditions and weather reports. I believe in things I can touch, measure, and verify. I don't believe in those things the same way anymore. Not after Route 287, not after mile marker 47. Good evening or good morning, depending on when you're listening to this. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 44 years old, and I've spent the last 22 years of my life behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. I'm from Casper, Wyoming, born and raised, and I've driven just about every highway in this state more times than I can count. I want to be upfront about something before I start. I am not a man who spooks easily. My father drove long haul for 30 years and always said the biggest danger on the road wasn't ice or dark. It was a driver whose imagination worked faster than his hands. I grew up believing that. I still believe parts of it. But there are things I cannot explain. Things that happened on the night of November 9th on a stretch of Route 287 that runs through the Wind River Range between Dubois and Riverton that I have replayed in my mind every single night since. Things that made me sell my rig, walk away from a career I had dedicated my entire adult life to, and refuse under any circumstances to drive that route again. Route 287 through the Wind River corridor is what we call a dead corridor. That's not a ghost story term. That's just what drivers call roads where the cell signal dies, the radio gets unreliable, and the distance between gas stations feels like a punishment designed specifically for you. It is beautiful in the day. Genuinely, almost painfully stunning mountains on both sides, the kind of sky that makes you feel small in a good way. But at night, and especially in November, when the early dark comes in fast and the temperature drops without warning, it is one of the loneliest stretches of pavement I have ever known. I had run this route maybe 60 or 70 times over my career. A contract with an agricultural company out of Casper had me hauling feed and supplies west toward Lander, and sometimes further out toward the Idaho line. I knew every curve, every pothole the county had never bothered to fix, every gas station that closed before 8 p.m. and every one that stayed open. I had driven this road tired in snowstorms once with a busted left headlight and nothing but a prayer and 20 years of muscle memory. So when they gave me the November 9th run, I didn't hesitate. Pick up in Casper at 5 p.m., westbound delivery in Lander by midnight, routine, clean, easy. The first hour of the drive was unremarkable. The heater in the cab was working well for once. I had a full thermos of decent coffee, and I had an old country music playlist going through the Bluetooth. The load was stable and strapped clean. The sky was clear for about 40 miles until it wasn't. Around mile 180, the clouds came in from the northwest fast, the way Wyoming clouds move, like they're late for something. The temperature on my dash gauge dropped 7 degrees in less than 10 minutes. I noted it, adjusted my speed, and kept my eyes on the road. I'd seen worse 100 times. I passed the turnoff for Togoti Pass around 7:15 p.m., which put me roughly on schedule. The stretch ahead, the deep corridor through the Wind River Range, was about 90 miles of nothing. No towns, no services, a handful of pullouts, and the occasional Forest Service road cutting off into darkness that seemed to go on forever. At approximately 7:40 p.m., my CB radio crackled to life. Now, CB activity in that corridor isn't unusual. Truckers still use it. hunters coming in off late season, the occasional rancher with an old rig. But what came through wasn't a conversation, and it wasn't on any channel I'd set. Just static at first, the kind that sounds like white noise with texture, like it has weight to it, and then underneath it, something that made me reach for the volume dial. It sounded like a child counting, not clearly, not in a way where I could make out every number, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence, the unmistakable sing-song of a kid playing a counting game. One of those games like hide and seek, where you count before you go looking. I turned the volume up. The counting stopped. Static, then nothing. I told myself it was bleed over from another frequency. Baby monitors sometimes bled onto CB bands, especially in remote areas where the terrain bounced signals in unpredictable ways. It was an unusual explanation, but not an impossible one. I turned the radio down and kept driving. By 8:10 p.m. I was deep in the corridor. No other vehicles in either direction for as far as my headlights could tell me, which wasn't unusual on a Tuesday night in November. The beams punched about 400 feet into the dark ahead, and beyond that was just the vague outline of tree line closing in on both sides of the road, the mountains above them invisible against the overcast sky. I noticed mile marker 47 the way I always noticed it, which is to say, almost not at all. A small green sign on the right shoulder, partially obscured in season by overgrowth. I had passed it dozens of times without a second thought, except this time there was something standing next to it. I saw it for no more than 2 seconds before the truck's movement carried me past. My brain processed it the way it processes unexpected input on a familiar route slowly, with a kind of reluctant disbelief. A figure standing at the shoulder, close to the marker, facing the road, too dark and too brief for detail. I told myself it was a hitchhiker, which would have been unusual at that location and hour, but not impossible. Hunters got stranded. People had car trouble on side roads all the time. My mirrors showed nothing. The shoulder behind me was empty. I reached for my phone and tried the Wyoming Highway Patrol non-emergency line, mostly out of instinct. If someone was stranded out there on a cold November night, it wasn't my job to stop, but it was someone's job to know. The signal meter showed 1 bar, then none. The call failed before it connected. I drove on. 15 minutes later at 8:25 by my clock, I saw her again. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded in the moment, too. I went through every rational possibility in order, the way my father taught me. I had passed a different sign. I had seen a different person. I had misjudged the distance. I was tired, but the figure was the same position, same shoulder, same stillness facing the road, watching the traffic that was only me. And this time, as my headlights swept over her, I had just enough time to register 2 things. She was a woman, middle-aged, and she was wearing no coat. In 28-degree weather, on a highway in the Wind River Range, at 8:25 in the evening, no coat. I pulled over, I know. I am aware it wasn't a smart move, but 22 years of driving builds a particular conscience about roadside distress, and that conscience isn't easy to argue with at 8:25 on a cold night. I left the engine running, the hazards blinking, and climbed down from the cab. The shoulder where she had been standing was empty. I stood there for a long moment, my breath fogging in the cold. The highway silent, except for the idle diesel behind me. I walked 20 steps in each direction. I shone my flashlight into the tree line. I called out not loud, but loud enough. Nothing. No footprints in the frost that had already settled on the gravel edge of the shoulder. No disturbed brush, no sound, no movement, no response. I got back in my truck. When I climbed back into the cab, I felt the cold immediately, not the outdoor cold I'd brought in with me, but a different variety entirely, the kind that settles into a space and refuses to leave regardless of what the heater says. I cranked the heat up. The gauge read 72 degrees inside the cab. It felt like 40. I sat for a moment before pulling back onto the road, and in that moment I looked at my dashboard camera, the one the company had installed 2 years prior for insurance purposes. It recorded continuously onto a loop drive, overwriting every 72 hours. I don't know what made me look at the screen, some instinct I can't name. The camera was angled to capture the road ahead, and in the corner of the frame, a sliver of the passenger seat. What I saw in that corner of the screen on the live feed, not a recording, was a shape in the passenger seat that was not there when I turned and looked directly at the passenger seat. When I looked at the screen, a shape, indistinct, roughly the size of a child, sitting with knees together, hands in lap, head slightly bowed, the posture of someone waiting patiently. When I turned to look at the actual seat, nothing. I looked back at the screen, empty. Whatever had been there in the camera was gone. My hands were shaking. I noted that the way I'd note a change in road conditions, my hands were shaking, my mouth was dry, and I had a very clear, very simple thought. I need to get off this highway. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road. The CB crackled again before I had reached 40 miles per hour. This time there was no static, no searching. A girl's voice, young, maybe 7 or 8, completely clear, as though she was sitting in the seat beside me, said, "Don't go past the tree." I turned the volume off. My heart was hitting so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I focused on the road, the center line, the practical and physical reality of 40,000 pounds of truck and cargo moving at highway speed. I focused on my hands on the wheel and the feel of the road through the tires. I focused on anything and everything that was real. And then I saw the tree. There is a large dead pine on the left side of Route 287, approximately 6 miles past mile marker 47. I've since confirmed it on satellite maps. It's there. You can see it standing alone and leafless about 30 feet back from the shoulder. Its branches spread out like arms that have been reaching for something for a very long time. I had passed it dozens of times. I had never given it a second thought. That night, there was something at the base of it. I should have kept driving. I knew that in the moment, some part of me was already screaming it. The voice on the CB radio still echoing in my head. Don't go past the tree. A warning, not an invitation. I understood that on some level that had nothing to do with thought or reasoning. I slowed down anyway. My headlights swept over the base of the tree as I decelerated, and I saw it clearly. A small figure seated at the base of the trunk, cross-legged, arms wrapped around her own knees, head turned down and away from the light. A child. She was wearing a yellow raincoat. I remember the color the way you remember the details of an accident, with that terrible involuntary clarity, bright yellow, the brightest thing I'd seen in 2 hours of darkness. I stopped the truck. I sat there with the engine running and the hazards on, staring at this child in a yellow raincoat sitting alone at the base of a dead tree off a remote Wyoming highway in November, and I made the decision that I have regretted every single day since. I got out. The cold that hit me this time was wrong in a way I don't have good words for. Not the sharp, clean cold of mountain air. Something heavier, damper. The cold that comes up off standing water. The cold of places that don't see sun. I walked toward the tree with my flashlight in my right hand, gravel crunching under my boots. The girl didn't move as I approached, didn't flinch at the beam, didn't look up. I stopped 10 feet from her. "Hey," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, too small for the space around it. "Are you okay? Are you hurt? Is there someone with you?" She didn't answer. I took 2 more steps. "I'm a truck driver. I can get help. I can call someone." And then she looked up. I have tried to describe this in the months since. I've sat with my wife at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. and tried to find the words, and I've come close, but I've never gotten it exactly right. What I saw was wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when something has studied normalcy without fully understanding it, like a copy that missed something essential about the original. The face was not monstrous, it was not disfigured, it was simply profoundly incorrectly assembled, and the eyes were too wide and too steady, and they were looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as recognition. Not the recognition of a lost child who has found help, but something older and far more deliberate. She smiled. And when she smiled, the counting began, the same sing-song rhythmic counting from the CB radio, except that now it was coming from everywhere simultaneously, from the tree above me, from the darkness to my left and right, from the road behind me, surrounding me completely, the way sound surrounds you in a place with no escape direction. I was already running. I don't remember making the decision to run. I remember the gravel under my boots and the cold in my lungs and the step up to the cab and the gear shift and the accelerator. And I remember that my door was not fully closed when I hit 30 miles per hour. I pulled it shut without slowing down. I drove. I did not look in the mirrors. I did not look at the camera screen. I did not touch the CB radio. I fixed my eyes on the center line and I drove at 70 miles per hour through 2 significant curves that I knew were there and compensated for on muscle memory alone, because I was not capable of anything more deliberate than the single repeating instruction that had replaced every other thought in my mind. Keep moving. The counting faded around the 2-mile mark. Or maybe I simply stopped being able to hear it over the sound of my own breathing and the engine. Either way, by the time I passed mile 55, The road ahead was just a road, dark, cold, empty in both directions, but only a road. I reached Lander at 9:58 p.m., an hour early. The dispatcher at the yard, a young guy named Trevor I'd worked with a handful of times, looked at me when I climbed out of the cab and asked if I was all right. I told him I'd hit some ice and it had rattled me. I didn't tell him the rest. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready. It wasn't until I got to the motel and sat on the edge of the bed with every light in the room on that I noticed what was on the passenger seat. A single yellow button, bright yellow, the kind used on children's rain gear, sitting in the center of the passenger seat, which I had confirmed was empty when I left Casper that afternoon. I always checked the cab interior before a long run. That seat had been empty. I did not sleep that night. I reported the experience to the Wyoming Highway Patrol the next morning, in as measured and factual a way as I could manage. I told them I had seen what appeared to be a child seated at the base of a tree near mile marker 47 on Route 287, and that she had disappeared when I approached. I gave them the location as precisely as I could. They sent a unit, no child, no evidence of anyone having been at that location. The officer who called me back was professional and polite and clearly believed I had been exhausted and mistaken. I requested my dash camera footage from the company. There had been a technical issue, they said. The drive had corrupted. 72 hours of footage gone. The IT coordinator said it happened sometimes with the older units in extreme cold. I drove for 3 more weeks after that night. Short runs, daytime only, close to Casper. I kept the CB radio off the entire time. I didn't take a single night route. Then I stopped. People have asked me since I quit whether I think I made the right call. Whether I regret walking away from 22 years of work over one night on one road. The honest answer is that I don't fully know what happened on Route 287 on November 9th. I cannot tell you what that child was, or whether she was a child at all. I cannot explain the voice on the CB radio or the shape on the camera screen or the button on the passenger seat. What I can tell you is that something shifted in me on that road. Something that I have come to accept is not going to shift back. I still have the button. It's in a small box in the top drawer of my nightstand. Sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, which is more nights than I'd like to admit, I take it out and hold it in my palm and I remind myself, whatever happened out there, I am home. I made it home. To everyone listening tonight, I am not asking you to believe me. I know how this sounds. I've replayed every rational explanation there is more times than I can count, and I've made peace with the fact that none of them hold up all the way through. But if you ever find yourself driving westbound on Route 287 through the Wind River Corridor, and maybe you will, because it is a genuinely beautiful road in the daytime, and the world doesn't stop needing things move from one place to another just because one driver stopped doing the moving. If you ever find yourself out there on a cold November night, and you see a green sign on the right shoulder that reads mile marker 47, keep driving. Don't slow down for anything standing at that shoulder. And if you hear a child's voice on a frequency that has no business working, turn the radio off. Don't try to make sense of it. Don't turn up the volume. And whatever you do, whatever you see at the base of that dead tree by the side of the road, do not stop. Do not get out. Do not let her look up. Just keep driving.